Today across these islands of Britain and Ireland, we celebrate the achievement 100 years ago of women's suffrage, with, as Michael said, the Representation of the People Act, which extended the parliamentary vote to some women, those over the age of 30, and the property, as well as to servicemen as well, apparently over the age of 19, and men over 21. So we'll be learning here today in PRONI about the historical context of that achievement by suffragists and the effects of extending the franchise to women from our speakers Marie Coleman, Diane, Urquhart and Alan de Bromhead. And of course there were many individual women who contributed to the suffrage movement, and the impact of some of them will be described by our next set of speakers, Glynn, Kelso, Sonia Tiernan, Neil Watt and Aileen McEwen. And at the end of this morning there will be a short time for questions to the speakers. So then this afternoon we'll be discussing the contemporary relevance of suffrage with a panel of contributors, expert in the field of equality, Aileen McGinley, Carmel Gates, Michael Wardlow and Anne Carver. So a very full day we have, and a very rich day, I think. So I'm going to start by telling you a story about one particular Irish suffragist and her granddaughter, Hannah and Micheline Sheehy Skeffington, to make the link between suffrage and where we are today as far as equality is concerned, which is both an inspiring and a depressing story at the same time. So, Hannah Sheehy married Frank Skeffington in 1903, and they took each other's names as their commitment to an equality of status within their marriage. And Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, as many of you will know, was a most remarkable woman, a suffragist, a socialist, a Republican and nationalist, as was Frank, who in addition to being a suffragist, he used to wear a badge, Votes for Women. He was a socialist and someone who supported nationalist aims, but not their means, if you like. He was also a militant pacifist. Hannah, along with Frank and Margaret and James Cousins, founded the Irish Women's Franchise League in 1908, and we'll be hearing more about that this morning. Its newspaper was the Irish Citizen, which Frank was a co-founder of and wrote for between 1912 and 1916. So what happened during the week of 1916, Hannah was very involved in supporting the rebels in the GPO and carried messages between the GPO and the College of Surgeons. Frank, on the other hand, did not support what was happening, even though he supported the aims. But what he did was he spent his time trying to set up a citizens' army to stop looting in Dublin, which he failed. He did fail to do that. But on his way home on the Tuesday evening of Easter week, he was arrested on Portobello Bridge in Dublin by a British officer, John Bowen-Courtis, and he was used as a hostage by a raiding party. Frank was very well known. He was quite eccentric and wore +4s and all this tweedy stuff and a big beard, so the British troops knew that they wouldn't be fired on if they had him with them. But during that raiding party, he witnessed Bowen-Courtis shoot dead a young boy on Rathmines Road, and the next morning Frank was taken out and summarily executed in the yard of Portobello Barracks, along with two journalists, he was a journalist as well, who'd been arrested the night before on that raiding party. It was 4 days before Hannah knew what had happened to her husband, and in the meantime Bowen-Courtis led a raid on her home, looking for material to justify Frank's murder. It was actually the father of that young boy who came to tell Hannah he'd seen Frank's body in the morgue at Portobello Barracks. That's how she found out. But in her attempt to get justice for this unlawful killing, Hannah met British Prime Minister Asquith in London to demand a full public inquiry. Instead, he offered her £10,000 hush money, which I calculated is worth over £800,000 today, which she refused out of hand. When the inquiry, there was an inquiry, proved a travesty, Hannah resolved to go to the US and to tell the truth and nothing but the truth about what happened to her husband and to the Irish people at the hands of the British. Giving the authorities the slip, she sailed from Glasgow with her 7-year-old son, Owen, Micheline's father, using false passports. Hannah's epic journey, undertaken as a leap of faith when newly widowed and travelling with her young son, was incredibly courageous. Over an 18-month period, Hannah visited 21 states and made over 250 speeches to massive crowds in New York, Boston, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, and many other smaller cities and places. At one point in Connecticut, British agents attempted to abduct her across the border into Canada so they could arrest her. 100 years later, her granddaughter Micheline has retraced that journey, visiting many of the places that Hannah spoke and giving her own talk, making a documentary, that we hope will be made this year. I say we because I helped fundraise for it and went on parts of it. I was in the States with Micheline for parts of it. We called the project Hannah and Me Passing on the Flame. So let me tell you about Micheline. She's a plant ecologist who taught for over 20 years in NUI Galway. In 2014, Micheline took a complaint to what was the Equality Tribunal that the National University of Galway had discriminated against her on grounds of gender regarding access to promotion to senior lecturer, so it's contrary to the Employment Acts. Micheline won that case and was awarded €7,000, which she promptly gave to 5 other women in the college in exactly the same position to underwrite their legal action. Their case has had to be taken through the courts, and while one woman has settled with the universities, for the others their case is ongoing. Despite a well-organised campaign and persistent campaign, the university has resisted change, and one of their arguments for not promoting women being that the university is no different from others in having gender inequality, which is quite true. Academic institutions are not alone in perpetuating gender inequality. We know from recent controversies in the BBC that inequality remains entrenched there. The Me Too campaign, drawing attention to sexual harassment, shows how far we have to go before women are treated as equals in the workplace, and not only in Hollywood. In order to survive and keep their jobs, women have often remained mute, while brutal men have done what they do because they can or could. But today, social media campaigns have given women a voice, both individually and collectively, to overcome the shame which in the past has so often acted as a mechanism for control, and still does, sadly. So while women now have the vote, political representation remains one of inequality. Our governments do not reflect a gender balance, and this in turn, women's interests are poorly represented, although there are exceptions. And this morning I was listening to the achievement of many women in professional positions, very high professional positions, but the cost of that is that they are dependent on low-wage labour, often by women, in order to do that. And of course, women are not a homogeneous group, and differences in our experience of inequality are strongly influenced by our class and the social capital it affords or denies us, our race, sexual orientation, and our abilities and disabilities. We have to see and acknowledge these differences when we talk about equality today. And it's very important to see also that many women have been left behind in the equality stakes. And this year's International Women's Day events in Belfast are going to be on that theme and the impacts of austerity on many women's lives. The changes in benefits that are designed as a safety net to stop families plummeting into poverty are now being sanctioned with impunity, and universal credit and personal independence payments are crippling low-income families and those with disabilities. And we do not have equality here in Northern Ireland with the UK in terms of either abortion or marriage equality. And when we look at the global situation, we must shudder at the desperate plight of refugees and the millions being trafficked into modern-day slavery. And for young girls, this mostly means into the sex industry. This is the result of wars, poverty, and climate change, all of which both affect affect both men and women, you know, old and young. So this is a dark picture when we reflect on the inequalities of the world, particularly as experienced by women. But perhaps it has always been thus, and with our modern media we are all too aware of it. But for feminists it is also true that our understanding of the underlying patriarchal nature of global inequalities spurs us to action and to find hope in women's empowerment. And that is certainly happening through the world also. So you may know, and I certainly am inspired by the Women's March in the USA in its resistance to the misogyny of their current president and solidarity with women across all differences. And is continuing to work. It has done many things, but what it's concentrating on currently, which I think is very important in relation to this debate, is in national voter registration, which has sought to exclude particularly people of colour and poor people and so on in the US. And that's important, I think. So, in conclusion, we are indebted to the suffragists for gaining us the vote, but we do not have equality. And actually, I was reminded this morning of a programme that the Women's Hour, BBC Women's Hour did on what was the most important event of the 20th century. It was not suffrage, it was the contraceptive pill, which has freed women, and that's why reproductive rights are such an important issue still today. So, while resistance to inequality continues, the classicist Mary Beard, in her recent book, Women in Power, argues that patience is not a virtue in this regard, and we need to redefine power. If you were watching the Channel 4 news last night, you would have heard one young woman saying that what we are now seeing is a fourth wave of feminism. She had a sense, she said, that things were beginning to tumble. A reflection of the hope and determination of a new generation of feminists. She also said that if the suffragettes were around today, they'd be more intersectional, in other words, more reflective of the complex identities that make up the women's movement. So that is very hopeful, and it's very good to see. So this morning now, let us hear more about the hope and determination of women, and some men as well, of course, who 100 years ago led the movement for suffrage in Ireland. Thank you, sir.
Just to start off with the basics, as we all know, the enactment of the Representation of the People Act on the 6th of February 1918 granted votes to women over 30 subject to the property qualification in both Britain and Ireland, and then in November 1918 the Parliament Qualification Act obviously allowed women to stand for Parliament. And the campaign, if anybody saw it, I say the film Suffragette was shown over the weekend, and that's probably what most people are most familiar with. And I think the campaign is most often seen as the culmination of that wider British campaign, prominently pursued by well-known activists like the Pankhursts. But I think from an Irish perspective, it's very important not to lose sight of a complementary yet distinctive Irish women's suffrage movement, which ran in parallel to the British movement, but reflected unique social and political dynamics in Ireland in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And also to take account of what's happening in Ireland in this period is part of an international movement. Joanna talked about the fourth wave of feminism. What we see internationally spreading throughout the US, Western Europe, is the first wave of feminism. So what's happening also has a large international dimension that I think we shouldn't lose sight of either. So if we look to what those specific dynamics in Irish society and politics were that politicised women in Ireland, most historians would, I suppose, date the politicisation of women on specifically gender issues to the campaign in the 1860s to repeal what were known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. These were a series of laws passed in the 1860s aimed at curtailing the spread of venereal disease among soldiers, and the way to curtail it wasn't to stop the soldiers doing what they were doing, it was to allow for coercive medical inspection, incarceration and treatment of prostitutes. So that the gendered nature of this legislation, there was a problem with the soldiers, so obviously the women were the problem, not the men themselves. And the campaign, it was such a harsh and such an intrusive provision which it allowed for. It mobilised quite a lot of women to try and at least modify these provisions. Under this act, women, particularly a lot of the women who plied their trade around the Curragh camp, or the centre of the British Army in Ireland, could just be incarcerated in hospitals like Dublin's Westmoreland Lock Hospital without any say-so of their own. It was all compulsion. It was compulsion, and it was. You talk about bodily integrity being invaded. Well, I suppose it was the epitome of that. And many of the figures who became prominent in both the Irish and the British suffrage movement appear to have really appear first as political activists at this time. Anna and Thomas Haslam, some of the earliest recognised suffrage campaigners in Ireland, they were active in the Dublin branch of the wonderfully titled Ladies' National Association for the Abolition of the Government Regulation of Vice. And Isabella Todd, who was probably a name that's familiar to a lot of people for her advocacy of suffrage in Ulster, was also involved in the London executive of that society. This is just one of a number of campaigns which these suffragists were involved in the late 19th century. Isabella Todd was also involved in campaigns to reform married women's property rights. So we see women become politicised through campaigns directly related to gender, and then that I suppose automatically almost segues into their campaigning for suffrage. By being involved in these campaigns, like repealing the Contagious Diseases Act and seeking greater property rights for married women, these women realised the need for women to have a more active voice in politics in order to have an input into legislation which had a direct effect on women, but into which women had no input. And I think this is especially true of Isabella Todd, being influenced, I suppose, by the circumstances. But background, these women's background was also quite important for explaining why they emerged as supporters of equality issues. Anna Haslam was a Quaker, and a lot of the commentators who have written about her and looked into her background would argue that her commitment to equality was in many ways a product of her Quaker background, a religious grouping that eschewed hierarchies. So I think a lot of religious views in a lot of these cases also help to explain why these women were formed in the way they were with regard to political issues. And Anna Haslam there, formerly Anna Fisher, who's pictured there with her husband, was also one of a small number of Irish women who signed the first parliamentary petition put forward by the great philosopher John Stuart Mill, arguing for female suffrage as early as 1866. Now it's notable, of course, I suppose, recognising the class dimensions of the day, that the effort to extend suffrage in 1866 is to all householders without distinction of sex. Isabella Todd then and the Haslams went on to set up the first dedicated suffrage societies. In 1872, Isabella Todd set up a suffrage, just the North of Ireland Women's Suffrage Committee, and a few years later, in 1876, the Haslams set up a suffrage society in Dublin, which would in time become the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association. And from that time, what we see in the late 19th and early 20th century is a proliferation of various regional suffrage societies throughout Ireland. Now, they tend to be urban-based. Characteristics of the Irish suffrage movement in this period is it is largely an urban movement. It is also largely a middle-class movement. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about it in the paper today, but it's possibly a question for the panel discussion and the Q&A, is the whole class dimension to the extension, or even in fact the limitation, of the franchise. And again, to comment on the international side of what's happening, these campaigns emerging in Ireland in the late 19th century, the politicisation of Irish women who later campaigned for franchise echoes parallels with politicisation of suffragists elsewhere. If we look at the US, with the United States, for example, the people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pioneers of the campaign for female suffrage, were influenced through their involvement in abolition, in efforts to abolish slavery. So we see a sort of a political formation of women who become involved in campaigns for equality, and then start to realise that one of the groups that really require campaigning for equality issues are women. So there's international dimensions there. We can trace similarities between the way in which Irish women are politicised to seek the vote as are women elsewhere. Now, of course, in this period, normally when you talk about Irish history in the late 19th century, suffrage and women's issues tend to be an aside to the big elephant in the room of the Home Rule movement and the land campaign. And the suffrage campaigners I've spoken about so far came largely from a liberal unionist background. And the Haslams and Todd, they represented that more sedate, certainly by later standards, a more patriarchal, I suppose, form of liberal unionism. But that wasn't representative of Irish women as a whole. Nationalist women were also becoming politicised at this time, especially in the southern counties, through these campaigns for Home Rule and land reform. In 1881, nationalist women played a small but nonetheless significant role in the nationalist movement through the Ladies' Land League, filling a gap in leadership created by the imprisonment of Charles Stewart Parnell and other prominent male nationalists. When they were imprisoned for their opposition to the 1881 Land Act, it was the Ladies' Land League under the leadership of Parnell's two sisters which really kept the movement alive, though of course as for their reward for their efforts was to be effectively shut down once the men got out of prison. And while it was short-lived, the Ladies' Land League was a route for politicisation for nationalist women and a forerunner to organisations such as Inniu na hÉireann and commemorate in the later 20th century. And I think a very good example, a very good personification of the way in which the Ladies' Land League was a forum for politicising suffragists is epitomised by Jenny Wise Power, who started her career with the Ladies' Land League and then moved into suffrage campaigns, very involved in the Irish nationalist movement as well, but also I suppose one of a good example of one of the first elected female representatives at local government level. And I think that's a lot of the focus tends to be on Constance Markievicz, and rightly so, as the first woman elected at the level of parliamentary politics. But I think it's no harm to recognise as well the significance of the enfranchisement of women at regional, at municipal government level, which precedes 1918. In 1887, Belfast, women householders in Belfast were the first to get the municipal franchise in Ireland, followed by Dunleary and Blackrock in the 1890s. From 1896, women were allowed to sit as poor law guardians. And then one of the great, I suppose, from a general Irish perspective, democratising pieces of legislation of the late 19th century, the Local Government Act, which democratised local government, also allowed women to vote for county councils, but not to run for election to county councils. It wasn't until 1911 that they could also sit on county councils. Of course, in England, Scotland and Wales, they were allowed to sit in county councils from 1907, but they forgot to extend it to the Irish, and when they were asked about this, the government said, well, they never asked for it. So, always ask for it. Never let them use that excuse against you. And I think this involvement of women in local government still remains an understudied area of political and gender history. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, if they could vote and they could sit in all these local councils, then why did they not let them run for Parliament and sit in Parliament? I think the answer to that really is in the nature of the work of municipal government and national government. And municipal government looked after things like paupers and children and women and sanitation and food, so it was women's work. So I suppose one of the great arguments against suffrage, and maybe this is something we could throw back and forth in the Q&A as well, was why couldn't women vote? What was the problem with it? And I think there's that element of separate spheres. And national politics and high politics and diplomacy was not a woman's sphere, whereas local government and looking after the workhouses, well, there was an argument that you could let women do that because that was women's work. So I've looked a lot here at politicisation and how these female suffragists got involved. Why did these women get involved in these campaigns? But the unique nature of the Irish suffrage movement was also affected by social change in Ireland during this period. And the Irish suffrage movement is influenced in particular by very important changes to Irish education. Starting really around 1878 with the introduction of the Intermediate Education Act, which introduced competitive public examinations. And this led to an increase in schools for girls. You already had some specific girls' schools. Very good example here in Belfast would be Victoria College, founded by Margaret Byers herself, a supporter of suffrage. You had a proliferation, though, after 1878 of convent schools, of schools run by Catholic religious orders, and also other lay Protestant schools along the lines of Victoria in Belfast and Alexandra College in Dublin. And this expansion of second-level education inevitably created a desire for more women to proceed to the next level, which was third-level education. And in fact, only 3 years after the passing of the Intermediate Education Act, the 1881 census for Ireland showed an increase in the number of girls studying Latin and Greek. And that was a measure of their intention to try and get into university, because Latin and Greek were essential matriculation subjects. Now, of course, women couldn't just apply through UCAS or the CAO to go to university back then as they can now. So another campaign, I suppose, for women's rights, which plays out in parallel to the suffrage campaign, is the campaign for full access to universities for women. And the halfway house was reached in 1879 with the introduction of the Royal University Act. Now, part of the reason I'm not going to go into it here, because it's a whole university question in the later 19th century, the Royal University Act is partly introduced as well, or more, really the main reason for introducing it is to try and make sure that Catholics have Catholic demands for Catholic university, that's met as well, because Protestants at Trinity, Cardinal Newman had his Catholic university, but the NUI, the National University of Ireland colleges, were not seen by Catholics as adequate for their needs. So the Royal University Act was a bit of a halfway house. For women, it had the effect that they could sit the university exams and could take degrees from the Royal University, but they couldn't still enter university. And it was Trinity. Trinity became one of the, I think, the first of the old UK-wide universities to admit women in 1904. And then when that protracted Irish university question was finally settled in 1908, with the establishment of the National University of Ireland and Queens as a university in its own right, women were admitted fully to university. And I think this little ditty, which I found from a Queen's, one of the Queen's student magazines around 1915, gives you a sense of the strength of support for the suffrage campaign among Queen's students. The Queen's girl, who is it reads the Suffragette and calls old Christabel a pet, and thinks men are a silly set, or that's meant to be silly. The Queen's girl. So that's taken from Jennifer Fitzgerald's very good biography of Helen Waddell. But I think it just gives you an idea of how important the universities were, and the importance of women's education and getting education at the universities for advancing the campaign for female suffrage. So what we're seeing here is women getting greater opportunities, and obviously greater opportunities are going to lead to greater expectations. And the impact of education reform on the suffrage movement can be seen in a younger generation of suffrage campaigners who emerged in the early 20th century. And I think that new generation is epitomised by a lady who Joanna has already introduced us to this morning, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And the Sheehy Skeffingtons were very dissatisfied with the lack of progress. I mean, you take the first idea of giving the vote to women comes in 1866, and still 50 years later, it's still not there. And the Sheehy Skeffingtons were very dissatisfied with that lack of progress. the failure to extend the municipal right of women to sit in councils in 1907 in Ireland was just one example of that. But the Sheehy Skeffingtons were also found the very staid nature of existing Irish suffrage societies not to their liking. And this is what led them in 1908 to set up the very different type of organisation, the Irish Women's Franchise League, which did resort to some of the more militant tactics which up until this point had been totally eschewed by the nice middle-class liberal unionist ladies of Belfast and Dublin. The Irish Women's Franchise League marks a very big change in the tactics of Irish suffrage. But it should be, while there are parallels between the activities of the Irish Women's Franchise League and what the Women's Social and Political Union were doing in Britain, there was still quite a distinction. The Sheehy Skeffingtons and the Irish Women's Franchise League, where they had direct action or militant tactics, they focused exclusively on political targets. While I'm speaking here today, Micheline Sheehy Skeffington, who has already been mentioned, is down in Dublin Castle reenacting the smashing of a window in Dublin Castle by her grandmother. We are assured that the glass window in question is actually made of sugar and water, so she won't get into any trouble for that. But that was an example. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in 1912 smashed these windows in Dublin Castle, but Dublin Castle was the administrative centre of British rule in Ireland, so it was a political target. They didn't just go around putting bombs in post offices or blowing up stained glass windows in cathedrals. The Irish Women's Franchise League focused more on political targets. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington was imprisoned briefly for her activities, but it's important to note, I think, that the Irish women were never subjected to the harsh treatment, the force feeding and the like of which the Women's Social and Political Union had been were subjected to, partly because Irish society probably wouldn't stand for it. But this is 1912, 1914. The Irish question in British politics is tense enough without the British force-feeding the daughter of an Irish nationalist MP. So I think that there's various reasons why the Irish suffrage movement is quite different from the British suffrage movement, and is also, Irish suffragists are treated quite differently. Another thing which the Irish Women's Franchise League did was to set up the first, gender issue newspaper, the Irish Citizen, which ran from 1912 to 1920. I'm just briefly going to mention the Women's Social and Political Union. Yes, they were different from the Irish Women's Franchise League, and we don't see much of the Women's Social and Political Union, the British Pankhurst movement, in Ireland until about 1914. There's a brief flurry in 1912, I think it was, when two British suffragists came over and threw a blunt hatchet at Ascot's head. It didn't do him any harm. It didn't do him a bang on the head, doesn't seem to have helped him much either. But it's the first half of 1914 where the Women's Social and Political Union start to put pressure on, try to put pressure on Ulster Unionists in particular. It's a period when Ulster Unionists are threatening to set up an Ulster Provisional Government, so the WSPU think, well, maybe we put some pressure on them and see what happens. So you have, and Diane has actually has set this out in great detail on her excellent book on women in Ulster politics. At the end of it, there's this wonderful appendix listing every action by the Women's Social and Political Union in Belfast, and it's just, you get the sense of just how intense their activities were between January and August 1914. But it all stopped in August 1914. The suffrage campaign in Britain and Ireland and the arson of activities of the Women's Social and Political Union in Belfast included drew to a very swift halt when the First World War broke out in August 1914. And it's an irony that the war halted the suffrage campaign and probably did a lot of damage to the coherence of the campaign. But the irony is that in the end, it was the war and the women's contribution to it which convinced the government to concede the demands for female suffrage. Now, as we know, partial suffrage was granted in 1918, and the age differential recognising great loss of male life during the war, you couldn't have a situation where there would be more women on the electoral franchise than men. Full franchise equality, of course, wouldn't come to women in Great Britain and Northern Ireland until 1928, as Michael Willis mentioned in his opening speech. The Irish Free State were a bit ahead of the game, and the newly created Irish Free State brought in universal suffrage in 1922. An unusually unusual example of Ireland being ahead of the game with women's rights, though of course that was to prove a false dawn for women's rights in Ireland. But even this period, the timing of the granting of suffrage also brings in that international theme which I wanted to reflect slightly today. The granting of suffrage to women in Ireland and Britain in 1918 reflects the significance of the First World War internationally in extending female suffrage. We see quite a considerable number of belligerents in 1918, 1919 grant female suffrage at this time. And 1922, what happens in 1922 with the Irish Free State granting female suffrage also reflects an international trend where the enfranchisement of women tends to come as a result of revolutions or state building. So we see Russia in 1917, and of course the first Russian revolution was very closely linked to International Women's Day in 1917. But newly independent countries, Israel, China, India, female suffrage coming as a result of revolutions that lead to the establishment of new states is another international dimension. I think we see that reflected in the Irish Free State in 1922. Now, I have unusually, we're all very good today in sticking to our timing, so I'm going to draw these ideas to a few concluding remarks. Yes, Irish women came by the vote in the same way as their British counterparts. And while the campaign for Irish female suffrage had parallels with the British campaign, a lot of the campaigners in Britain and Ireland both campaigned against things like the Contagious Diseases Act, yet the Irish campaign reflects the unique political and social dynamics of Irish society in the later 19th century, including the politicisation of nationalist women through organisations like the Ladies' Land League and the impact of educational reforms. It's also worth getting out of our sort of Irish insularity for when we look at this, these dynamics as well, and recognise that Irish women in this period were also part of that wider international movement, the first wave of feminism. Thank you.
I was delighted to accept this invitation. It's always good to have an excuse to come home. You can maybe tell by the accent that I'm from Belfast originally, and I spent a long time in the Public Record Office, but it's lovely to have a chance to bring some of that research home today, particularly as it is the centenary of women's suffrage. Women involved in the suffrage movement across Europe and the Americas had different experiences whilst sharing the same ultimate objective of attaining the right to vote. Distinctions were caused not only by ideological beliefs concerning the merits of constitutional or militant action, but also by geography. In Ireland there were rural, urban, regional variations, and the political framework, as Marie mentioned earlier, which really affected the Irish women's suffrage movement, I think separated the Irish experience from many of the international suffrage movements. And this complexity that we see in the suffrage movement was very clearly revealed in the Ulster suffrage movement. It's often been overlooked, and the discourse has been dominated by the militant suffragette campaign of 1912 to 14. And Indigenous suffrage societies have been castigated as small, reticent to comment on the contemporary political situation, and non-militant. And I think this paper will hopefully bed some of those presumptions this morning. Feminism was popularly seen as an avant-garde and minority interest in the 19th century and beyond. Yet we do see active Irish involvement in the question from the 1860s onwards. Women and some men began to collate the liberal arguments of natural rights and equality to female enfranchisement. The parliamentary vote subsequently came to be identified as the fundamental component of citizenship that many suffragists expected to instigate moral and social regeneration, emancipation from social drudgery, virtuous convention, and economic and political subservience. Belfast-based feminist Isabella Todd, who was rightly foregrounded earlier on, is absolutely key to this early Irish suffrage movement. She initiated the first Irish suffrage tour in 1872 and allegedly was attracting audiences of hundreds, and at times 500 people are recorded. Todd then formed the first Irish Suffrage Association, North of Ireland Women's Suffrage Society, in the following year. She was the self-proclaimed, and I quote, chief pleader for women's suffrage and the most renowned Irish feminist of the 19th century. Her death in 1896 therefore left what was referred to as a wide gap in the ranks of the early workers. Nevertheless, the organisational foundations which she laid enabled and inspired other women to participate in the most active phase of Irish suffragism in the early 20th century. As the suffrage movement gained momentum, it diversified to such an extent that could only be described as complex. By 1914, there were 20 separate associations in Ulster, ranging from the militant extremism of the suffragettes to the constitutional and religiously based activities of the Belfast branch of the Anglican Church League for Women's Suffrage. Todd's earlier association underwent several name changes, but from 1909 was known as the Irish Women's Suffrage Society, often abbreviated to its initials, the IWSS. Based in Belfast and with branches in Whitehead, Derry and Bangor, this non-party organisation leant towards militancy. It also had a progressively socialist, reformist agenda. Dr. Elizabeth Bell, one of the earliest doctors, was one of its members, and she sought to counter what she referred to, and again I quote, the conspiracy of silence, by publicly discussing social and moral problems. And looking at the activities of this small but very dynamic Belfast-based organisation, they really pushed the boundaries. So they were talking about infant mortality, sex education, venereal disease, white slave trafficking, factory legislation, married women's employment, equal rights, all discussed at their weekly meetings. But in striving to break those social taboos, this organisation, like those working for the reform of the Contagious Diseases Acts in the late 19th century, ultimately failed to maximise popular appeal because such a progressive agenda discouraged those with more conservative beliefs from joining their ranks. A branch of the Men's Political Union for Women's Enfranchisement was also established in Belfast. Pro-militant, it was the only all-male suffrage society ever operative in Ireland. The establishment of the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation in 1911 was at the suggestion of Miss L.A. Walkington of Lisburn Suffrage Society, and this provided some much-needed cohesion to the suffrage movement. But the Federation never embraced all because it excluded militant bodies. It also had a Northern Committee to deal with Ulster suffrage questions. Nevertheless, the Federation was popular. It grew from an initial affiliate of 4 societies to 20 organisations, 70 of which were Ulster-based by 1913. Suffrage was a hugely controversial question, and this is just an example of the amazing material which PRONI holds. So this is a public display of anti-suffragism with someone masked and being paraded through Strabane, we think as early as 1910, so pre the militant campaign. We'll look in a few minutes at how the suffragists, when it emerged into a more violent campaign, were actually viewed, but this is an early one. This is what women had to face. So it was publicly controversial, these women were often mocked, and that meant that no more than a minority of women were prepared to declare themselves suffragists. By 1914, Irish suffrage societies had membership figures estimated at around 3,500. About 1,000 of those were Ulster-based, but those figures were comparable to the density of English suffragettes when we do population breakdowns. Although overtures were made to attract working class support into the suffrage movement, in Ulster addresses were delivered from street corners and dinner or meetings were held at factory and mill gates in both Belfast and Derry to try and prove, and I quote, that suffragists were just ordinary women. The movement remained, as Marie mentioned, largely middle class in composition, and here the Irish experience fits a much broader transnational complexion of suffrage societies. The proliferation of societies and the diversity of objectives associated with the vote meant that solidarity amongst Irish suffragists, although often lauded, was often fragile. As early as 1912, the complexity of the Irish suffrage movement was proclaimed to be, and I quote, in such a tangle that it may be a somewhat perilous, and is probably a thankless task to endeavour to unravel it. There was, however, a degree of cooperation between northern and southern suffragists. In mid-1912, for example, the first mass meeting of both bodies was held in Dublin. The treatment of suffragette prisoners was collectively repudiated from 1913. Many suffragists throughout the country united in support of suffrage amendments to the Third Home Rule Bill. We also see suffrage speakers regularly addressing sister organisations throughout the country and also in England. Further cooperation was facilitated by the adoption of an anti-government campaign in 1913, and this is a policy which had been already widely used by the Women's Social and Political Union, the Pankhurst organisation, to oppose Liberal candidates in English constituencies. The Irish Women's Franchise League and Belfast Irish Women's Suffrage Society subsequently cooperated to organise open-air meetings and distribute suffrage literature, including the not-so-subtly titled Keep the Liberal Out. They tried to oppose the election of Hogg, the Irish parliamentary candidate, standing in Derry, but they were unsuccessful. But again, an interesting collaboration between these usually separate wings of the movement. But even with that latter example, not everyone agreed that this was tactically astute. Mrs. Chambers of Belfast doubted the effectiveness of advocating an anti-government campaign without first attaining the vote. And she attested that, and I quote, "The pressure of the vote is the only pressure that has any permanent value." Dora Malone's 1930 address at London's Hyde Park was similarly divisive, albeit unintentionally. Her claim, and you can see it behind me, that Irish suffragists were made up of, as she put it, nationalist, unionist, orange and green, extremist and moderate, provoked further disunity. Her focus solely on the work of the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation led the Irish Women's Franchise League and Belfast Irish Women's Suffrage Society to complain to the Irish Citizen because their associations predated the establishment of the Federation, and Malone was accused of reaping benefit from their earlier exertions. Indeed, the Irish Citizen could later only admit, somewhat lyrically, that, and I quote, "the varied societies flitter away their power in internecine rivalries and antagonistic methods and principles." It concluded, "Suffrage has wandered in a multiplicity of paths that seem to lead nowhere save to labyrinthine confusion." Irish suffragists were also working in a politically hostile climate dominated by Home Rule, and one which was often lacking suffrage support. As the Northern Suffrage Society stated in 1913, they fought with, and I quote, "the accepted thought that in Belfast nothing will be entertained but Home Rule struggling with unionism." Many suffragists were hostile towards both unionist and nationalist women who advocated party political considerations before their emancipation and did not demand the vote as a price of their politicking. Tensions between suffragists and unionists were considerably heightened by the Unionist Party's decision to grant votes for women under their plans for a provisional government in Ulster during September 1913. Suffrage was divisive amongst all political parties, and the Unionist Party was no exception. Edward Carson, the Unionist leader, was a renowned anti-suffragist. Mary Ann, Dowager Marchioness of Abercorn, a Vice President of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council and later President, was also head of the Dublin branch of the Anti-Suffrage League. But in contrast, James Craig, the Unionist second in command, supported women's suffrage. He was not only responsible for opening the public galleries in the House of Commons to women, as accommodation in the Ladies' Gallery was insufficient, but he addressed a suffrage meeting in Lisburn with Lady Betty Balfour in 1910. The politics of Edith Seven March of Londonderry, which I know we're going to hear more about later, are also an interesting mix of unionism and suffragism. She was Vice President of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council from 1919 to 59, and she really illustrates that, again, unionism and suffrage were not always diametrically opposed political objectives. She was a supporter of Millicent Fawcett's English Association, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and gave her support on the basis that women should be freed from what she depicted as indirect bondage. However, Craig appeared on his last political platform supporting suffrage in 1910, and Edith Londonderry navigated the increasingly difficult political terrain between unionism and suffragism by conducting her suffrage activities in England. Unionist records, and trust me, I've read a lot of them, don't give us any clues as to why they said they would include votes for women under their plans for a provisional government in Ulster. One thing we do know is that they never interpret this as a concession to suffragists. Rather, it was presented, albeit somewhat loosely, as a reward for the work of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, and Carson later averred that this was simply an extension of the municipal franchise, which is a really interesting comment to think on how provincial he saw this new assembly would actually be. The Unionist pronouncement regarding votes for women provoked considerable rivalry amongst suffrage groups, and again this really highlights the fragility of the Irish suffrage movement. This rivalry was especially pronounced in the northeast of the country. Many suffrage associations claimed to have been instrumental in winning what they interpreted as a historic concession. Margaret McCoubrey of Belfast Irish Women's Suffrage Society, for example, emphasised that the essential groundwork completed by her organisation deserved recognition. Not everyone agreed. Lillian Medge, Honorary Secretary of Lisburn Suffrage Society, claimed that the sustained campaign conducted by all northern suffragists provided the impetus for the Unionist decision. The Irish Citizen, however, rejected any suggestion that, as they put it, the anti-suffragist Ulster Women's Unionist Council had any share in winning votes for Ulster women. But the Northern Committee of the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation was a little more conciliatory. It suggested, in contrast, that the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was instrumental in promoting this pledge, and ascertained that, and I quote, "No one ever earned recognition for their services better than the Ulster women have done." The Irish Women's Suffrage Federation, however, again provoked further disunity regarding the pledge. They published a letter in the Irish Times on the 13th of September 1913 saying that they knew about Unionist intent regarding votes for women from January of the previous year. This gave rise to accusations of conniving with Unionist politicians and of idle boasting. And the Northern Committee of the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation refused to give any explanation for withholding this information, and in November they reiterated that the first pledge had been won from Unionists by their efforts, whilst the work of the Unionist Party women helped gain the second public concession of September 1913. What no one doubted was the significance of this move on the part of Unionists. LAN Priestley McCracken, who's an amazing woman, we don't know an awful lot about her in personal terms, but a really passionate feminist, she recounted this, and I quote, as epoch-making, and described it, and again I quote, as an amazing marriage of unionism and women's suffrage. But as a marital union, this was short-lived and unhappy. Even in the midst of initial triumphalism, there was some scepticism. Mrs. Chambers was one of several Ulster suffragists who depicted placing credence in Carson for women's liberation as akin to following, as she put it, will-o'-the-wisp. By October 1913, Margaret McCoubrey was also publicly expressing her distrust at both the Unionist Party and the entire political system. And again, I think an interesting comment that people are starting to move beyond constitutionalism and looking elsewhere. She stated, and again I quote, "We know that whatever party places a suffrage bill on the statute book will simply do so to save its own skin. No doubt the Ulster Unionist Council would already gladly forget that such a statement was ever made. Sir Edward Carson seems most anxious to forget it." And this was prophetic. In 1913, that pledge was neither confirmed nor fulfilled by Unionist leaders, even after the provisional government was formed on the 24th of September. Thereafter, pessimism concerning the sincerity of the Unionist pledge became widespread. The Irish Citizen, for example, tried to distance itself from the pledge, and their critique of Unionists became increasingly aggressive, especially of members of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, who they depicted, and I quote, as servile party women. The development of this stronger anti-Unionist stance heightened the complexity of the suffrage movement, as some suffragists, again particularly in Ulster, believed that the level of criticism directed toward Unionists to be unjust. And it's just a little sample of this from February 1914. This is an anonymous letter published in the Irish Citizen, but really an expression, I think, of conservative feminism, saying that the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, although not supporting suffrage, was actually having a liberating effect on women. These differences in opinion ultimately impacted on support for the suffrage cause in Ulster. Many women were forced to make difficult decisions concerning political priorities. And a letter from a member of an unnamed Orange Lodge aptly summarised the practical effect of this. It stated, "Such a display of political animus has lost the suffrage cause many friends north of the Boyne." The unfulfilled suffragist pledge by unionists also led the Pankhurst Women's Social and Political Union to establish branches in Dublin, Cork and in Belfast. But militancy was not solely an import. Belfast Irish Women's Suffrage Society, for example, was responsible for the earliest suffragette attacks in Ulster, occurring as early as November 1912, when we see windows being broken in Belfast in protest against the defeat of Snowden's suffrage amendment to the Third Home Rule Bill. This conscience claims that militancy was centred in Dublin until 1913, and that prior to the arrival of the WSPU there was no militancy in the north of the country. We see a second outbreak of militancy in Ulster during 1913. From February to April, for example, 9 pillar boxes were attacked and telephone wires were cut in Belfast. We also see in that year the first recorded act of militancy outside of Belfast, and what we see in February is an attack on a post office in Newton-Hamilton in County Armagh, where a mourning card was left bearing the inscription, somewhat ominously, of "Votes for Women." By mid-1913, the Irish Women's Suffrage Society established a small militant committee and began to issue emotive public statements in defence of militant action, which stated, for example, "If legalised protection of little children could be brought a week nearer by our vote, we would be right to burn down every public building in the land." This society's decision to become a solely militant organisation in September 1913 coincided with the initiation of the Women's Social and Political Unions campaign in Ulster. Initially, the Pankhurst organisation had been interested in Irish affairs because of the Irish Parliamentary Party's stance on women's suffrage, which was not a supporting one, and Redmond in particular was strongly opposed. So we do know from 1910 that the Pankhursts were in contact with the more militant Irish suffrage societies and had visited Ireland at least twice. The WSPU's campaign in Ulster developed not only on a wider scale than that in Dublin, but was closer in temperament to their English campaign because it focused on privately owned rather than government property. The Irish Women's Suffrage Society, as the most militant northern suffrage organisation, entered into easy cooperation with the WSPU. And by April 1914, so many members of the former organisation had joined the Belfast branch of the WSPU that Belfast Irish Women's Suffrage Society was officially disbanded. The WSPU's Belfast organiser was Dorothy Evans, who you can see somewhat grainily on the right-hand side. And Evans really focused on that unionist pledge, which was unfulfilled. She, with a couple of other members of the WSPU, held a 4.5-day siege of Carson's London home, which resulted in a meeting with the unionist leader. But after that meeting, the WSPU, and I quote, declared war on Carson, and that comes in March 1914. By the next month, Belfast was described to be in the midst of, and again I quote, a genuine revolution. The campaign augmented from threatening letters, uninvited visits to the homes of unionist leaders, and invasions into the offices of the pro-unionist press, to arson. Of 7 arson attacks carried out by British suffragettes between April and May 1914, for example, 5 occurred in Ulster, so this really does become the storm centre of the suffragette movement. This arson campaign concentrated on unionist-owned property, but we see Newtownards Race Stand, Ballylesson Church near Lisburn, Belfast Bowling Pavilion, all being burnt. And in a 6-month period from March 1914, 13 women were arrested for suffragette activities in Ulster. Once in prison, some of these women used similar means to secure their release as their British counterparts sustained hunger and thirst strikes. To try and deter women from this course of action, the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act was passed in March 1913. Popularly known and somewhat more catchily as the Cat and Mouse Act, this legislation facilitated the temporary discharge of hunger striking suffragette prisoners until they were fit enough to be recommitted. And this was applied to Mabel Small, a member of Belfast WSPU, and there was widespread protest at this being applied. Militancy intensified the divides in the suffrage movement. And suffragettes were, as you can see, I think mocked and feared in equal measure. This is one of my favourite cartoons. But this idea that there's something wrong with the suffragette, you know, the state isn't brought into question, rather these are women who are unhinged, often depicted as unmarried, or if they were married, this was alleged to be a suffragette's home. And you can see a less than pleased worker returning home to see disarray after his hard day's work. With the arrival of militancy into Ulster, some women resigned from suffrage societies, other organisations changed their name and affiliation to distance themselves from the suffragette movement. So it was controversial on a more general level, but also within the suffrage movement. The Irish Citizen also chastised Northern suffrage societies, questioning whether they had been, and I quote, as active as they should have been to prevent the encroach of the WSPU. So again, these tensions become really fraught. There were violent scenes when suffragettes heckled Joseph Devlin, the Northern Nationalist leader, in December 1913 in Belfast, and even with the added protection of members of the men's political union, and I quote, to save the women from rough handling, one suffragette was thrown downstairs, and scenes like this became increasingly commonplace. So this isn't just public mockery, verbal abuse, this becomes really physical. Mrs. Alexander, a Belfast of the Irish Women's Suffrage Society in Belfast, wrote a complaint to the Belfast newsletter concerning the unnecessary violence was directed towards suffragettes. And she asked, and I quote, surely two men stewards ought to be able to eject a woman from a meeting without the assistance of the audience. Belfast suffragettes also claimed to have received anonymous letters threatening physical violence if their militant campaign continued. Lillian Spender's account of the crowd's reaction to a suffragette disruption of a unionist demonstration further alludes to the extent of public hostility. She wrote, and I quote, two suffragettes interrupted while Carson was speaking. I heard nothing but the roar of fury that went up from the crowd the moment they began. They were speedily disposed of. During 1914, physical attacks at WSPU meetings became increasingly common in Ulster. In April, just to give a quick example, unionists were alleged to have broken up a suffragette meeting in Belfast, and in the following month, a WSPU poster parade at Belfast Harbour awaiting Carson's arrival led to more violent protest. That latter event involved male and more unusually some female unionists, and the Belfast newsletter consolidated the Irish Citizen's claim that suffragettes were subjected to, and I quote, physical abuse at the hands of irate mill girls. And WSPU member Mabel Small, who I mentioned previously, allegedly had her hat, and I quote, dragged from her head by the crowd who pulled her hair and disarranged her clothing, portions of which were practically torn to tatters. In a state of collapse, Small was taken to hospital. Less than 2 weeks later, another suffrage heckler at a meeting of East Belfast Women's Union Association was attacked in a similar way. Her hat was also dragged off, her hair was torn, she was pelted and bruised with stones. Sylvia Pankhurst also claimed that Ulster suffragettes were subjected to such violence that WSPU organiser Dorothy Evans brought an assault charge and a case for false imprisonment against the Belfast authorities. I've struggled to track that down, and there's often an element of fantasy in some of the Pankhurst's memoirs, but we live in hope that I'll be able to perhaps corroborate that, but at this point we just don't know. In an attempt to curtail suffragette activities in Belfast, some women, like Mary Johnson, Margaret McCoubrey, were constantly watched and escorted by detectives. Indeed, the extent of public animosity was such that 2 Australian tourists were attacked in Ballymena on the mere suspicion of being suffragettes. They weren't recognised, and they too were subjected to violence. The response of those who experienced militant attacks further alludes to the perception of suffragettes as unwomanly, wretched creatures bent on violence and destruction. The normally conservative Church of Ireland Gazette, for example, responded to the WSPU's arson attack on Ballylesson Church by depicting those who were responsible as, and I quote, vile, dangerous enemies of society. Militancy climaxed in Ulster with the bomb attempt on Lisburn's Church of Ireland Cathedral on the 31st of July 1914. And again, Lillian Spender's a wonderfully gossipy diarist, and this is her response. I won't read it all out, but interestingly, she refers to the suffragettes responsible as brutes. So the language is really, really interesting. Suffragettes arrested for this attack had to receive police protection from hostile crowds whilst being taken into custody. However, neither arrest, verbal criticism or physical aggression effectively curtailed the suffragette campaign. Suffragettes' disregard for authority was also manifest in their trials. And these trials were conducted in concert with the WSPU's policy of refusing to recognise the court. So they were told to frequently interrupt the proceedings. The first women arrested in Ulster for militant acts were the women who we saw earlier, the WSPU's Dorothy Evans and Madge Muir. At their Belfast trial in 1914, and again PRONI has those records and they're wonderful, the courtroom had to be cleared because of continual interruptions from the assembled suffrage supporters, and as, and I quote, the two prisoners kept up a duet which reduced the proceedings to an absolute farce. They would announce their intention of leaving the court and were only restrained from doing so by physical force. In protest, Lillian Medge, another WSPU member, broke windows outside the courthouse and then she was subsequently arrested. Evans constantly denied the right of the court to try her by comparing the treatment meted out to suffragettes to that of unionists, and this became an increasingly familiar trope in the 1913 to 14 period. As Evans noted, and I quote, Sir Edward Carson and the Craigavon party were not interfered with. Women today deny the law because they have no voice whatever in the making of the law. Evans also tried to attack the judge and had to be restrained by no less than 6 policemen. In Ulster, the hostility and at times violence directed towards suffragettes was intensified by the Malicious Injuries Ireland Act. That facilitated an increase in rates to cover the cost of damages incurred to private property. County Antrim subsequently paid £92,000 in damages for property destroyed by the suffragette campaign, and a 3-penny levy in the pound was applied to the county's rates, and that was never going to be a vote winner, very intentional pun. At the apex of suffragette violence in Ulster, the militant campaign was abandoned, and as Marie mentioned, this was due to the outbreak of the First World War. The WSPU's decision, however, was reportedly received, and I quote, with displeasure and disgust by some of their keenest Irish members, none of whom were consulted about the cessation of their campaign, which was in line with the Pankhurst fairly autocratic control of the organisation. The war not only caused more disruption within militant ranks, but also marked the start of the demise of the suffrage movement. The Irish citizen became increasingly pacifist in sentiment, which meant that pro-war suffragists, who were most numerous in the northeast of the country, found themselves increasingly alienated and without a public platform. The passage of partial female suffrage in 1918 did not lead to any sense of reconciliation amongst women. This was evident in the relationship between suffragists and unionists. In November 1918, LAM Precy McCracken denounced Theresa, 6th Marchioness of Londonderry, President of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council and anti-suffragist, for issuing voting instructions to unionist women. McCracken interpreted this as a self-expedient move to buttress the political fortunes of the Unionist Party and wrote, and I quote, by capturing and creating a subservient, obedient electorate amongst women. The Ulster suffrage movement was neither small, politically reticent, or lacking in indigenous militancy. Their cry for political freedom, and that is how they packaged this, was largely unfulfilled. The establishment of a separate Northern Ireland Parliament in 1921 saw some discussion of equal suffrage coming in 1924, but here the focus was not on women's rights or democracy, but it was on following any precedent set by the imperial government. And again, any of you who have looked at the early years of the Northern Irish state will know that is an absolutely characteristic response. An equal suffrage bill was introduced to the Northern Ireland Commons by Joseph Devlin, the Northern Nationalist leader, in 1927, but was defeated on its second reading. Consequently, equal suffrage was only implemented in Northern Ireland in 1928 after it was introduced by the imperial government. But this measure, just as the first instalment of Votes for Women, brought neither equality or a regeneration of feminist impetus in its wake. Many suffragists envisaged that the vote would be the ultimate vehicle to sexual equality, but that could never be attained by purely legislative means. As a result, equality was elusive. Women made up just 1 to 2% of the British, Irish and Northern Irish parliamentary representatives during the interwar period. Therefore, only those with the most realistic aspirations, who believed that to have a voice in electing members of Parliament and in vote was to have a fragmented political power and was a very different thing from freedom. Failed to be disappointed with the impact of female enfranchisement because this was the beginning of an emancipatory process rather than an end. Thank you.
So I'm not here representing the men solely, of course, but firstly, just let me say thank you to the organisers here at PRONI for putting on such a great day. To Marie as well for getting this all organised. So what I'm going to present to you today is something quite different to what you've already seen in the first two talks. We've seen some fascinating history of the suffrage movement in Ireland. What this research does is looks at the impact of these changes in voting rights. So in the same year as the Representation of the People Act, of course, we have a very important election in Ireland that leads to the victory of Sinn Féin and the establishment of the first Dáil in January 1919. So what we want to do is to sort of revisit an old question in Irish history as to whether these two events are linked, whether the Representation of the People Act changed the political environment in Ireland enough to allow this Sinn Féin victory to take place. Okay, it was such a dramatic change in Irish politics that many people have made the link before between these two events. So what I will do today is as I said, something quite different to the approaches that have been taken already. I'm an economic historian, and my co-authors are also. So what we do, our approach is very much to try and bring some quantitative evidence to these sort of questions, to bring the numbers to bear on these debates. So we sort of zoom out into the bigger picture and try and make some inferences based on the sort of broad trends that we see. Okay, so firstly a little disclaimer that this is probably not the final word on this question, but we hope we've found something that we can add to the debate. Okay, so pretty simply we just want to ask this question and see if we can say anything about it. Okay, were these two big events in Irish political history, or in UK political history more generally, were they linked in some way? And of course we know that this is the first time women are voting in Ireland in parliamentary elections, and we want to see if these new voters were voting in any way differently to the previous electorate. Okay, so we think, and that the suffrage movement was sort of predicated on the idea that this would bring change, but nobody really knew what that change would be. Okay, and part of the reason that suffrage was denied for so long was because of this sort of fear of change. Okay, that there was no need to give women the vote because they already had the vote through the household franchise. Okay, so they had their interests represented by the head of the household, so there was no real need to take any risks with expanding the electorate. Okay. The other dimension to the Representation of the People Act that is often overlooked, I guess, is the fact that it enfranchised a large number of male voters also. And understandably, the attention is focused on the women's suffrage issue, and there's very good reasons to focus on that. Not least that this was the biggest number of new voters, but there was a significant number of male voters enfranchised also. Okay, so we want to see if we can untangle these two effects, or these two different types of voters who are now voting. Another issue we want to try and address is that of turnout and of utilisation of a vote. And it's already been pointed out that this was not the end of the road for equality in terms of women. And one of the important points to recognise is that turnout may have been important in this election also. And there's been previous studies that have looked at turnout among new voters, people who recently gained the vote, which suggests that people are a little bit slow to perhaps use their newly acquired rights. So we can't see this as the end of the process. This is the beginning of women's role in electoral politics. An important step, but as I said, not the end. Just to give you a little sort of preview of what we find, the idea that the changes in voting rights had a large or direct impact on the Sinn Féin victory has been widely outlined before. We don't really find evidence for that. Okay, now we'll sort of go into more detail on this, but our overall picture, our overall results don't suggest that this was the defining factor of the 1918 election. In fact, we may have uncovered evidence that new women voters may have been less likely to vote for Sinn Féin, and if we think about who was enfranchised in 1918 in terms of women, that may not be so surprising. Again, this is often overlooked in this link between the 1918 election and the Representation of the People Act. People have sort of identified the young men who were enfranchised as being the ones that would be natural Sinn Féin supporters, but they overlooked the fact that more women were actually given the vote, and these women were intentionally thought to be more conservative, okay, because they were older women, and there was the property requirement that was maintained for which restricted women's voting rights. And part of the reason for doing this, it seems, was to make sure that the women who did get the vote were not the radical women, not the radical young women who would later get the vote. Part of the story of the Representation of the People Act in 1928 that gives women finally the vote on equal terms to men is that the sort of fears of the establishment that new women would be would change the course of British politics were proved to be untrue, and this was part of that sort of paved the way for the vote to finally be extended to the younger radical flappers who were given the vote in 1928. We do find some suggestion that new young male voters were more likely to have voted for Sinn Féin, or certainly the correlations run in that direction. Okay, so the associations between having more male voters, more new male voters and votes for Sinn Féin is a positive one. But what's also important, and as I mentioned already, that turnout seems to be an important factor in this story. And it seems that we have lower rates of turnout for both types of new voters. Okay, so part of the reason why perhaps the extension of the franchise in 1918 had less an effect than people expected to is because these new voters were less likely to vote in the first place. And this is sort of supported by evidence in other countries where people are a bit slow to utilise their vote and to actually exercise these newly gained rights. And that sort of political participation is a process that needs to be learnt and doesn't happen overnight. And this is something that we find some support for. Okay, so perhaps I don't need to go through too much of the motivation. This is sort of the culture of economics. When you present papers, you have to justify why you're doing it. Especially if it's an economic history piece, you have to sort of say why the history matters, why do we care about this. But this, of course, is all part of the decade of centenaries that is being celebrated or being marked across the Republic of Ireland. This is sort of, you won't be able to see it, but this is the sort of lists that are of historic events that the government of Ireland has identified as being important in this 10-year period. And the 1918 election is sort of falls somewhere between the Easter Rising and the formation of the first Dáil. Okay, so it's not explicitly mentioned, even though it is often and rightly identified as a major turning point. It doesn't quite fit into the sort of common narrative we have for this period. So why this is such an important turning point is, of course, that it marks the end of the Irish Parliamentary Party as a political force, and it ushers in a dominant Sinn Féin party in Ireland, which has the number of representatives, or a big enough number of representatives, to actually form a Dáil in Dublin in 1919. Okay, and this is a dramatic change not just in the sort of the names of the parties, of course. This is a change in Irish nationalism, from one that is committed to constitutional and parliamentary methods to one that is much more Republican and is pledges to further the Irish cause of nationalism through any means necessary. So this is a big change in the way Irish nationalism is being represented. Okay, we also care about what happens to voting rights more generally. Okay, so what does voting rights mean in terms of political outcomes? And in this sense, we sort of try and put this work, as Marie has done, in a more international context. And this is part, Ireland's suffrage experience is part of a wider story across Europe and across the world. And there has been literature, and people have looked at the extension of voting rights across the world and in different places, and the effects that had on things like public spending, on the size of the sort of the welfare state, and on other aspects of policy. This is sort of an already existing literature that people are interested in. Okay, so I'm only going to give a very brief overview of sort of the things you might need to know about Irish history. Again, this audience is probably well versed in the sort of basics of Irish history. But as we've heard already, the Irish Parliamentary Party was the dominant force of Irish politics in the 19th century. Home rule is its stated goal and its principal goal. And part of the sort of interesting story about the suffrage movement and the Irish Parliamentary Party was that the Irish Parliamentary Party, at very least officially, sort of said that they didn't want to further the suffrage cause, the women's suffrage cause in Westminster, lest it take away from the issue of home rule. And they weren't willing to spend any political capital on the suffrage issue if it took away from it their ability to bring home rule to Ireland. Now, that's not the only thing, of course, that the Irish Parliamentary Party was interested in and managed to achieve some notable legislation in terms of a series of land acts and of other sort of social legislation in terms of social housing and things like that. But really, home rule was their reason for being. Okay, they were successful in bringing in home rule bills, getting them to be voted on in Parliament. But the first two, anyway, failed. Okay, the dominance of the party is solidified in 1910. Okay, in the December election of 1910, they win 73 seats of the 103 available. So they managed to get themselves into a position of a kingmaker in Westminster, okay, between the Liberals and Conservatives, and they extract the third Home Rule Bill in 1912, which, because of the Parliament Act in 1911, can only be blocked by the House of Lords for 2 years. So this means that the Home Rule Bill will become law in 1914. And this sets off a series of events that, again, many of you will be familiar with: the establishment of the Ulster Volunteers, and in response, the establishment of the Irish Volunteers in its aftermath. And again, as we've heard already, things by 1914, well, things are coming to a head, and Ireland is perhaps on the brink of civil war. But with the outbreak of war in 1914, everything sort of stops. Okay, everything is shelved for the time being, and energies are focused towards the war effort. And things can be taken up again after this. And of course, we know that wasn't acceptable to a certain number of Irish nationalists that rejected the call of Redmond to join in the British struggle. And we have 1916 and the aftermath of that. Okay, so that just gives you sort of a brief bit of context to the election. Sinn Féin itself, founded in 1905, Arthur Griffith's party is very different to the one that it would become in 1917. Not Republican. It was based on the idea of a dual monarchy that Austria-Hungary had established. But because of some of these accidents of history, Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin label gets applied to the 1916 rising by the press and by the officials in Dublin Castle, and it's known as the Sinn Féin Rebellion. Okay, and this results in the sort of various strands of more Republican nationalism coalescing around this label of Sinn Féin. Okay, and by 1917 they are able to contest and win by-elections and are on the sort of electoral up. They really sort of establish a coherent organisation, a political group in the Ardèche in 1917, which elects De Valera as president, and Arthur Griffith steps down as president. Okay, he's a vice president. The reason apparently that the Ardèche was allowed to go ahead without interference was that the officials in Dublin Castle didn't believe that these different groups would be able to maintain any kind of coherent organisation, and that they would let them have their meeting and fight about things and encourage any splits that were going. For a rare moment in Irish history where things actually came together. But it wasn't all plain sailing, it wasn't all a one-way street in the elections, in the by-elections after 1916. We have 3 early by-elections in 1918 that are won by the Irish Parliamentary Party. So it wasn't exactly clear that the momentum had fully turned towards the Sinn Féin movement. Okay, so again, this is just some information, some of the numbers that we need to probably be aware of in terms of the scale of the representation of the people. The Irish electorate has tripled. Okay, and this understandably why people have focused a lot of attention on this and the link between this election and the representation of the People Act. Just so many new voters were up for grabs that surely this must have had an impact on the politics of the time. Now, as we know, it's men and women are getting the vote. There's 2 different sort of groups. Only slightly more women are actually enfranchised than men, and this is partly because the number of men disenfranchised in Ireland under the householder franchise was actually larger than that, proportionally larger than in Britain. So something like a third of men were without the vote in 1917 in England, but half of men in Ireland were without the vote in 1917. Because of the different demographics and household structure and the differences between the Irish population. So the male franchise is a bigger deal in Ireland than it is in England. As we know, this is to all men over 21, and we know which women got the vote. And this sort of women over 30, this represented about 80% of women over 30, it's estimated, were entitled to vote from the restriction on property, disenfranchised probably 20% of women over 30. What's interesting again about the Irish context of this election and why the importance of the representation of the people gets noted is that the Representation of the People Act, and combine that with the fact that many constituencies were not contested in previous elections because of the dominance of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and you combine that also with the fact that it had been 8 years since the previous election because of the First World War. This is the longest period without an election in UK history. So that's estimated that probably only about 20% of the electorate in 1918 had actually cast a vote before. Which sort of underscores the fact that this was a wholly unknown electorate to most of the political parties. The results of the 1918 election are dramatic. When it's compared to the results of the 1910 election, you see the complete obliteration of the Irish Parliamentary Party and the landslide victory of Sinn Féin, winning 73 seats out of the 105. The IPP is reduced to only 6 seats, and a number of these are only attained through an electoral pact with Sinn Féin in the northern constituencies, so as not to split the nationalist vote in these areas. Vote shares, of course, tell you something different. We have a first past the post system that this election is running on. Vote shares are less dramatic when you look at it, and this is why these sort of systems are prone to landslides, as we saw the SNP landslide a number of years ago. These are sort of direct results of this electoral system. And things look a little less sort of clear-cut when you look at the vote changes. Nonetheless, it is still a dramatic result for a party that hadn't contested a general election in its history. Okay, so the key question is why this happened. Why was this landslide there, if it even was a landslide, but why was this dramatic change, why did it take place? So there's two sort of ways that we think about this. And one way that this could happen is that people just change their minds. Okay, they change their minds about what they feel about political parties, and they change their minds about the direction of Irish nationalism. So there are a number of sort of candidates that have been put forward for understanding why people may have changed their minds, why the mood of the electorate had shifted between 1910 and 1918. Of course, 1916 and the events that followed it, and the aftermath and the reaction to this by the British government has been identified as one of the main sort of things that changed people's minds. We also have the 1917-1918 conscription crisis, which is also another turning point. It's been identified in public opinion, with conscription being brought into Britain in 1916. Ireland is exempted from conscription to the war, but in 1918 the German offensive has really changed the sort of the views of the politicians in Westminster, who believe they have to rely on the last sort of resource of manpower that they have left in Ireland, that they bring through conscription. But this provokes a very dramatic response in Ireland and unites sort of all the different strands of Irish nationalism against conscription. And the Irish Parliamentary Party is as vocal as any against conscription, but because of their connection to the initial recruitment efforts in 1914, their calls are not sort of seen as being as genuine as those of Sinn Féin in terms of their opposition. So Sinn Féin sort of makes the most of this conscription crisis in 1918. Another reason that people have sort of identified as being an explaining factor of the decline of the Irish Parliamentary Party is not really about Sinn Féin's rise, it's about the fact that the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1918 was not a very efficient electoral machine. That they had sort of rested on their laurels in their time as an uncontested and unopposed party over the last number of elections, and this is why that their sort of electoral machine broke down. They weren't able to compete once a serious opposition put themselves forward. Okay, and then we have, of course, failure of Home Rule itself. The final achievement of Home Rule that had seemed to be realised on the eve of the First World War is, of course, shelved, and people are quickly realise that this is going to not be as straightforward in terms of enacting Home Rule in Ireland. And the sort of reason for the Irish Parliamentary Party, as they sort of stated themselves, was to bring in Home Rule. If they couldn't achieve this, then Irish nationalism would have to take a different route. So those are all the reasons why you might think that people might change their minds between 1910 and 1918. But equally, it could be just that nobody changed their minds, it's just the people who were allowed to vote were different. Okay, and that these represented different interests or different views on Irish nationalism. So, the parties at the time were aware of this change, and they were a little bit worried by the fact that this electorate was so unknown. If we take this quote from William Doris, who was the MP for West Mayo, he had a pretty clear view about which way these changes in voting rights would affect the Irish Parliamentary Party. They were very worried about the young men who would be getting the vote, but were pretty confident that the women granted the vote would be squarely behind the Irish Parliamentary Party. And again, still making the point that if the electorate hadn't been changed, the Irish Parliamentary Party would have been okay. So on the old register, we'd be perfectly safe. Now, of course, this turned out not to be true in William Doris's case. Okay, he managed to poll fewer votes, even though there's a vastly increased electorate in 1918. But the sort of contemporary view was that this was going to change things. Now, the idea that the extension of the franchise to women and to all men over 21 would have a big change and would be a big vote getter for Sinn Féin was sort of most famously put forward by Brian Farrell in 1971. That this was all that we need to know to understand the 1918 election and the Sinn Féin victory. That if the votes hadn't changed, the voting rights hadn't changed, we would still see the Irish Parliamentary Party as the victor. Now, of course, this has been challenged by a number of people since then, pointing out the obvious thing that the Irish Parliamentary Party was sort of on its way out in many ways by measuring the by-elections, that Sinn Féin managed to win 5 out of the 8 by-elections between 1910 and 1918 under the old register already. Okay, so it clearly wasn't, in those cases, a result of the changes in voting rights. Okay. When we talk about the impact of voting rights in general, changes in voting rights, the literature sort of suggests that these have not had as big effects as people would have perhaps thought initially. The studies of Britain that look at 1918 and the effects of the Representation of the People Act have sort of downplayed its impact on politics of the period, and that it did correspond with an increase in the Labour Party's vote, but it didn't change the position very much of the Conservative Party. It was a Conservative Party was elected again in 1918, and the Conservative Party was dominant in the interwar period. So it sort of downplayed this effect, and part of this is related to the turnout issue possibly, and to other factors. Okay, so I've already talked quite a bit about the sort of context of this, but what do we do that's different? Well, we want to look at each constituency basically and compare the vote share for Sinn Féin with the number of new voters in each constituency. Okay, so we're just going to look at the correlations between the new voters and the vote shares. So to do this is not a straightforward task. We have to actually link and find information for each constituency about how many voters there are, how many households, what sort of religious makeup of these places were, okay, to give us sort of a profile for each constituency. And we do this by linking the 1911 census and a very low level of aggregation to constituency boundaries. As you can imagine, this is quite a time-consuming task, but it gives us a sort of a picture of Ireland in 1918 by constituency. And we of course want to look at the election data from 1918. We also need to look at the number of male and female voters in each constituency, which showed some variation. Not every constituency was the same in terms of its number of new voters. And then we look at some other things. In terms of if you're looking at the male household, we want to look at the proportion of the male population that was non-household head but over 21. Okay, so this is capturing the new male voters. And some other demographic information we want to know about these areas before we sort of make any pronouncements on directions. Now perhaps you can't see this, and again this is what qualitative or what quantitative historians do. What we were surprised with was the level of variation between the constituencies in terms of the number of new voters in particular. So as little as 30% of the electorate in some constituencies, as much as 44% of the electorate. Now maybe that's not a huge range of women voters, and nowhere were women voters in the majority, and that was by design, as we've already heard. But there was enough sort of variation to try and look at these relationships a little bit more closely. So what we try and do is we do some statistical analysis of these relationships and look at whether there's correlations between Sinn Féin voting and the number of new, or the share of new voters in a constituency. So just to give you sort of a graphical representation of a simple two-variable relationship, we see that this is the share of the female electorate on this axis here, and then the Sinn Féin vote share up here. But basically all this is saying is that there's a negative relationship between the number of women voters and the proportion of the electorate that's female, and the Sinn Féin vote. So where there were more women voters, Sinn Féin vote was lower. Okay, so now that is not saying, and we're careful not to say that that means that every individual women necessarily were less likely to vote for Sinn Féin, but certainly where there were more women vote for Sinn Féin was lower. We see the opposite relationship when we think about new male voters. So the sort of idea that men would have that when there was more of these new male voters, you'd get a higher Sinn Féin vote, does seem to have some support in the data, the information that we've gathered. But what's interesting is that they are the opposite directions. Okay, so in many ways you could think that the quote that I put up from the Irish Parliamentary Party MP was accurate. Okay, that there was no real fear of women voters for the Irish Parliamentary Party. Again, partly this is probably because of the restrictions that were placed on women's voting in 1918. But the idea that women or that men would sort of favour Sinn Féin, these new non-household head men, which favour Sinn Féin, was probably probably accurate. Okay, so I've only two minutes to go through. Overall, we think they sort of cancelled each other out in many ways, and that there's no evidence to show that these two effects were actually positively related to the Sinn Féin vote. And we have to look elsewhere then for, and I'll just get through these bits because this is just some of the stuff we do. Okay, and if anyone's interested in that, there'll be a working paper of later. Okay, but we basically don't find the evidence that we would like to find suggesting that these two events are directly linked. Okay, so basically we think that women are not particularly in favour of Sinn Féin. Younger men may have been, but not to a great extent. But the final thing that we wanted that I didn't really get time to talk about was about turnout. If people are interested in this, we can talk more about it. But it seems the turnout was low for both these groups. And this may have muted the effect of any changes in voting rights that actually took place. And part of the reason why we don't see big changes is possibly because these groups were less likely to vote. Okay, so we conclude that the electorate changed its mind and that it is not therefore about the Representation of the People Act on its own, but means we have to look back to the old reasons about why the electorate did change its mind. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello everyone. So, I'm Glynn, and I'm from the Public Record Office, and I've been asked to give a little archival interlude, if nothing else, and heckling is encouraged, but please refrain from picketing, or if you have to, at the back of the room. So just to point out, during the comfort break there is actually some original documents that have appeared from the secure stores for you to have a look at. I'm going to refer to some of them throughout this talk. So I'd like to start with a number of contextual thoughts before I just jump into the actual words and voices of individuals represented within the archive. Really, in the pursuit of suffrage, which is relevant to both the representation of both men and women. And I promise not to go over my allocated 3 hours. Or maybe the chair will start throwing bricks with little messages on it. Yes.
Right, you may be forcibly removed.
Yes, not the first time. Right, well, we'll go with a few. So a little bit of a recap, just for my own mind, if nothing else. So prior to 1832, the right to vote was restricted to men who owned or rented land with an income worth 40 shillings or more per year, which today, if you think of it today, it's men with a rental value equivalent to £2,000 per month. So the first voting reform in over 400 years came with the Representation of the People Act in 1832, which gave the vote to men whose property had a rental value of £10 per year or more, giving about 1 in 7 men the right to vote. So such male individuals are recorded in freeholder registers and poll books, which are actually digitised by the Public Record Office, and you can search those on the PRONI website. So I encourage you to do that, just to see what those look like, those pre-1884 lists. But even after the passing of the Third Reform in 1884, only 60% of male householders over the age of 21 had the vote. So with discussion and opposition, a number of reforms took place in the 19th century, with the most radical changes marked today, 100 years later, occurring in 1918. So following the First World War, millions of returning soldiers would not have been entitled to vote in the December 1918 general election. So the Representation of the People Act 1918 was the first Reform Act to extend the franchise to all men over 21 in the constituency where they were resident. So men who had also turned 19 during service in connection with the First World War could also vote if they were under 21, although there was some confusion over whether they could do so after being discharged from service. But also in 1918, and quite significant, women over 30 received the vote if they were either a member or married to a member of the local government register, a property owner, or a graduate voting in a university constituency. So it would take a further 10 years before men and women were granted universal suffrage in the UK. Now, although I'm taking an archival point of view, I wanted to pose maybe a couple of questions, which I'm not going to answer. Okay? I'm not going to answer. But hopefully it'll encourage thoughts in your own mind to answer yourself, basically, as I work through some of the actual voices in the archives, which are locked away within the vaults. So during the extensions in the manhood suffrage, which I very quickly went through, had women a voice, or were their rights championed by others? I'd like to draw upon the words and experiences of 4 distinct individuals represented in the PRONI Archive Pacific to help us all reflect on the various opinions conveyed on women's suffrage, from commencement of the Act in 1832 up to equal franchise in 1928. I'll focus on 2 women and 2 men, including both vocal and silent voices, while incorporating other opinions on suffrage and representation recorded in original letters held in PRONI's care. So I'll use the exact words recorded in the archive, and as I mentioned, offer little interpretation. But I would like to hear more about how these voices speak to you yourselves, personal thoughts and reactions during the session and the discussion, and will be around the original documents during the comfort break to start a debate, if nothing else, looking at the original sources. So as you can see there, the first voice basically is that of John Stuart Mill, already mentioned and introduced, feminist writer, civil servant, later a member of Parliament. Mill was elected MP for the City of Westminster in 1865 on a platform including votes for women. His thinking on women's rights was influenced by his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, who's deceased in 1858. So in 1869, Mill published his essay, one of many, titled The Subjection of Women, in opposition to established opinions such as those of the Reverend John Gregg of Dublin, specifically in 1856, where he noted, this is where you start heckling, society does best when each sex performs the duties for which it is especially ordained. Now, a copy of Mill's essay can be found amongst the papers of Jeremiah Jordan, MP for South Fermanagh, where a number of his key statements unfold Hill's case for what he termed as perfect equality. So I'm going to quote Mill himself to generate some thoughts for you. So Mill writes, "The legal subordination of one sex to another is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement, and that it ought to be replaced by a system of perfect equality, admitting no power and privilege on the one side, nor disability on the other." He goes on by saying, "There remains no legal slaves, save the mistress of every house. I deny that one knows, or can know, the nature of the two sexes, as long as they have only been seen in their present relation to one another. Until conditions of equality exist, no one can possibly assess the natural differences between women and men, distorted as they have been. What is natural to the two sexes can only be found out by allowing both to develop and use their faculties freely." Although Mill's arguments were well received by suffragists and the Kensington group specifically, who filed the 1866 petition for women's suffrage, traditional views still won out. So again, speaking from the archive, some notations taken from Sir Joseph Peace, presented in the House of Commons. He noted this: "Woman is endowed with a most delicate organisation which sways the whole course of her life. It influences her actions and her mode of thought, and its effect is to make mankind afford her protection rather than turn her adrift in the vortex of political life." Okay, so I'll leave Hill there for you to think a little bit more about how he championed feminist ideas. And turn to the second one, and the second voice being someone with the pseudonym Marianne. Marianne was a workhouse inmate in the Belfast workhouse, which was up the Lisburn Road. And in 1865 she was admitted to the Belfast workhouse 5 times with her 1-year-old and 1-week-old daughters, each time remaining for several days. So in total she would have spent around 25 nights out of 31 in the workhouse itself. But why she is significant here, the workhouse officials recorded Marianne's occupation as prostitute. The Minute Book of Ballymena Board of Guardians make known the experience of such a very silenced voice in the workhouse. So by 1848 it was resolved that females admitted labouring under venereal disease, common prostitutes, or women who have each more than one bastard child be separately classed in the ward over the idiot ward, to be termed the penitentiary. Inmates of this ward are not to go into the dining hall at meals, not to attend divine service, but to be supplied with prayer books and testaments. I'm sure if Leanne McCormick's here, she'll forgive me for promoting her work on regulating sexuality, which has used a lot of original PRONI records to disclose that although women considered to be prostitutes used the workhouse as a place of refuge and respite, many lower working class women who had no obvious occupation but had maybe illegitimate children were classed as prostitutes by the workhouse authorities. There is no evidence that Marianne was an active prostitute. However, the prostitute label would have transformed her experience inside and outside of the workhouse. And indeed the records of the workhouse note that in 1868 Marianne died in child labour. Individuals such as Marianne had a champion and suffragist, Isabella Todd, who have also been introduced to this morning, who in 1871 established the Belfast branch of the Ladies' National Association to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts. So under the Acts, suspected prostitutes like Marianne were under threat to be arrested and forcibly examined. Although women were admitted as Board of Guardians through the Municipal Franchise Act of the later 1800s, the wide use of the term prostitute would have been used towards up until the late 19th century. But by 1886, the Acts were repealed and replaced by the National Council for Combating Venereal Disease, which disseminated information to both men and women and coordinated treatment. And there's a few documents relating to these issues on display. So the third voice. The third voice I've chosen is that of Sir John Cowans, Quartermaster General at the War Office from 1912 to 1919, and he was a member of the Army Council from 1914. Sir John worked at the War Office under the administration of Prime Minister Asquith. We've heard about the incident in Dublin already. But he stated on the 6th of May 1913 the following: "I am sometimes tempted to think, as one listens to the arguments of supporters of women's suffrage, that there is nothing to be said for it. And I am sometimes tempted to think, as I listen to the arguments of the opponents of women's suffrage, that there is nothing to be said against it." But as officials of the War Office corresponded with suffragists within movement, and corresponded with Edith Lady Londonderry in her role specifically as Colonel-Chief of the Women's Volunteer Reserve from 1914, and in her role with the Women's Legion established in Ulster 1915. Cowan, as a supporter of women's suffrage, worked very closely with individuals like Lady Edith, who were very keen to establish an active role for women when men were at war. A letter, specifically within the PRONI archives, gives a little insight into Cowan's persuasion and ideas, dated the 7th of September 1915, and he advises a very large part of the work in all hospitals can be undertaken by women, thereby allowing the transfer of non-commissioned officers and men to other medical units at home or abroad. Women should be registered under the following headings: dispensers, clerks, cooks and cleaners. Of course, work on the land was also undertaken by the agricultural section of the Women's Legion in 1915, which was a forerunner to the Women's Land Army established in 1917. So with further collaborative support, the Women's Legion became the first voluntary organisation to be accepted for military service when it was recognised by the Army Council under Lloyd George in 1916. And by 1917, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps developed out of the Legion. So supporters of universal suffrage later used these wartime developments to call for parity in the franchise, including the Home Secretary, George Cave, who stated in 1917, "War has brought us nearer together, has opened men's eyes and removed misunderstandings on all sides. It has made it, I think, impossible that ever again, at all events in the lifetime of the present generation, there should be a revival of the old class feeling, which was responsible for so much, and among other things, for the exclusion for a period of so many of our population from the class of electors." As you can see from the slide, the fourth voice I'd like to present abstractly is that of Mabel Small. And Diane has mentioned Mabel within the context of Belfast already. Mabel was a suffragette, and you first see her within an archival setting by the numerator's entry to the 1911 census of Ireland. Do search for her on the entry, the Census of Ireland entry for, just to see what the enumerator has written. It reveals her audacity during her active fight for women's suffrage. And I'll read what the enumerator has noted. Mabel Small information refused. About 37, teacher of sewing in Municipal Technical Institute, born in England. Living with Morris, information refused. About 43, born in England. Note, above were all the particulars which could be ascertained regarding these women. They stated that they are militant suffragettes and refused to give any information. Case was reported and instructions given to fill a form with any information which could be obtained. JFM, a very rare entry within the census materials. Mabel had a loud and public voice compared to some of the others I've introduced because of her active suffragette approach. A newspaper article within the archives, and it is on the table for you to have a closer look because I'm only picking out maybe 2 or 3 quotes from it. It relates to an attack on the Old Town Hall Belfast in 1914, and it states that a young woman named Mabel Small appeared in the dock wearing a green costume and carrying a bunch of daffodils. She is accused of maliciously damaging the window. During her hearing, she called out, "Did you find anything on me?" In response, the arresting constable replied, "In your bag were 4 half bricks." Okay, so 3 letters from a file created by the Belfast College of Technology reveal the confidence which she herself spoke within the context. So the 16th of April 1914, to the principal, dear sir, as you will probably have seen an account in the papers of my arrest and imprisonment, I beg to inform you that after 4 days hunger and thirst strike, I have been released under the Cat and Mouse Act and shall be at my duties at the Technical Institute on Monday as usual. Yours faithfully, Mabel Small. In acknowledgement to her letter, the Institute replied, I put it to you that it is an understanding in this place that everyone is required to abstain from propaganda work and give their whole energy to the work of the Institute. As far as possible, staff are expected to use the holidays for regeneration of their efforts so that they may return to their work with full vigour. So with valour, Mabel then sends a letter to the Institute to clarify her position on the 24th of June. Dear Mr. Forth, as we are nearing the end of the term and next week will be the last day of June, I am writing to remind you and through you, the committee, that my promise to refrain from militancy applied only to the term and that I reserve the right to do as I pleased with my holidays. I am sending you this reminder now in order that the committee may have time to fully reconsider the advisability of retaining me on the staff and in case I might be called upon to resume militant action. Assuming you always of the punctual performances of my duties as far as lies in my power. I am yours faithfully, M. Small. There was mass resistance to the suffragettes' approach, and 2 I'd like to pull out. The first is CAM Alexander, army officer, writing to his mother on the 5th of June 1913, and a little treasure, I think, amongst some of the suffragist materials. He writes, we went over to see the Derby. There was a bad scene when the wretched Suffrage caught the King's horse and nearly killed his jockey. I wish the woman had been given to the crowd. It would have stopped suffragettes. She is badly hurt. I enjoyed the day awfully. Of course, he was referring to Emily Davison, who later died of her injuries. But most amusing, if I'm allowed to use the word amusing, is Schomburg MacDonald, civil servant, writing in 1914, who suggests a novel approach in dealing with militant women. Suffragettes continue to rage furiously. I hope in time they will see how foolish and revolting their behaviour is. Moreover, It is calculated to set people against the cause which they advocate. I should like to marry them by force to strong men who would keep them in order. I did say heckling was required. So in conclusion, I'd like to refer back to the question offered during extensions of manhood suffrage. Had women a voice, or were they championed by others? I'm not going to answer, as I mentioned, just something for you to think about. But the voices from the PRONI archive do reveal something of the experiences of women and the advocacy of men during the 96-year struggle for equal franchise. And those voices do remain in the archive to be heard today. You just need a visitor ticket to access them. So John Stuart Mill published feminist commentary on women and the vote, arguing that having half the human race unable to contribute to society outside the home was a hindrance to human development. His writings circulated widely. Working class women such as Marianne were silenced with official labels until suffragists such as Isabella Todd actively campaigned against what she termed the men who devised such legislation. Marianne's personal experience were largely hidden, but can be revealed these 150 years on. The establishment of women into active duty by officials of the War Office indirectly championed later extensions to the franchise. And I'm sure you agree the personal stories, such as those of Mabel Small, survive in the archive today as an active voice for equal rights. So I'd like to end by posing a final question. So having heard the four voices from the archive in their own words, who spoke the loudest then, and who spoke the loudest now, and who changed the experience of women? So thank you very much for listening. And I'll be around just to look at the original sources. There's two I'd like to point out very quickly for close inspection, and they relate to the 1920s, something a little later than the emphasis today. The first is the hymn sheet for the funeral service of Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst from the papers of Charlotte Despard, held in PRONI. And Emmeline entered into life eternal on the 14th of June 1924. She was aged 69. But it is significant because her death preceded the commencement of universal suffrage by 18 days. The second one, which is the very last document, and a nice connection to the next speaker, is a file created relating to the exclusion order against Countess de Markievicz in 1924, where the Right Honourable Sir Richard Dawson Bates, Minister of Home Affairs, by virtue of special powers in 1922, prohibited the Countess from residing or entering Northern Ireland, specifically counties Down, Armagh, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Londonderry, the county of the city of Belfast, and the county of the city of Londonderry. So thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks to Marie for inviting me. Also thanks to Glynn for that last paper. It's making me think I need to do something more interesting with my holidays. So I'm going to focus on, as it's been said, very specifically on the personal papers, or the papers of Eva Gorbuz and Countess Markievicz. I suppose what's kind of really key to us, especially when we look at the papers here in PRONI, is that the personal papers and records of women are actually often very difficult to source, or indeed sometimes they're just simply destroyed because they weren't seen as actually important to begin with. And this has left us with a void in the history, especially of Irish women's activities for many years. So in contrast to this void of, archival sources, we have one very large estate collection held here, which is the Lisadell collection. And this includes the personal papers and political papers of two significant Irish women.
Lisadell House is an estate that's still situated, it's still there, it's actually open to the public again in County Sligo. And this was the childhood home of Eva Gore-Booth and her older sister, then Constance Gore-Booth. And their papers detail really, and I think sometimes we overuse words like remarkable, but actually are radical. But actually in this instance, they detail really remarkable and particularly radical campaigns and lives. Because obviously of what we're doing here today is our commemoration of Votes for Women and the centenary of this, what I'm going to do is focus on this particular aspect, because really there was just so many activities that the two sisters were involved in, we just wouldn't have enough time for the whole day to focus on them. But first what I want to do is provide a little bit of background on the two women. Both Constance and Eva rejected what was a very aristocratic heritage as members of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. And we can see even this early painting that some of you may be familiar with by Sarah Purser. And at the time, Sarah Purser would have been employed by their mother to paint this portrait of the two girls when they were 10 and 12 on the Lisadell estate. And this just gives us an idea into this. And that's actually, the painting is now in the Merrion Hotel in Dublin on public display. But Constance left Ireland in 1893 to study first in London and later in Paris. And that's where she met a Count Casimir Markovich, who was of Polish descent. And this is where, when she marries him, that she gets the surname Markovich and goes by the name Countess Markovich. Eva also moved to England not long after Constance had left, and she settled first in Manchester and later in London. And Eva was inspired by suffrage activities, and especially suffragette activities. Of course, the WSPU begins in Manchester, but even before that we have a movement, possibly due to the textile factories, the large abundance of women that are in the city as well. So we've got all these very politically active women, and she's inspired by this. And when the sisters returned to Lisadell for Christmas celebrations in 1896, we witnessed their first venture into suffrage politics. And Eva set about establishing the Sligo branch of the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association. And this was the first suffrage organisation in the area. Eva was elected secretary, Constance president, and their younger sister Mabel was the treasurer. The first official meeting was held at Milltown National School in Drumcliff, and the sisters ensured that the hall was dressed with suffrage posters, and we even have details of what these would have said, things like liberality, justice and equality. And Eva called on Irish women to follow the example of the farmers of Drumcliff. And somebody had mentioned earlier about this interaction, I think it was Marie was talking about the labour movement, and it's actually, this is what we see very specifically with the two sisters, this interaction of labour movement, labour economics even, and suffrage. And she insisted that in spite of opposition, that women should take affairs into their own hands in the same way as the farmers of Drumcliff. And actually one of the images that we have is actually a marketing poster by Eva and Constance have posed by it, and you can see the armband actually has Drumcliff Cooperative Creamery, and this is what the farmers had established, and this is what the two sisters actually basically marketed, if you like. In this way, Gore-Booth aligned herself to the economic organisation of low-paid farmers who had established the creamery, the Cooperative Creamery. Constance continued by recounting light-hearted anecdotes about extending the vote to women, explaining, "I have been told, amongst other things, that the vote will cause women to ape the other sex, to adopt their clothes, copy their manners and peculiarities, and that it will cause women to neglect their homes and duties, and the worst of all, present them from marrying. Of course, this may be true. Pigs may fly, as the old proverb says, but they are no likely birds." And of course, you know, we can see this, and Diane spoke about this already, this kind of, you know, this really very negative view that the suffragettes have at the time. And this, of course, is what Constance was up against, and this is what Constance was trying to argue against and say, this is not reality. But Sligo had never before witnessed such an open debate about what was an almost foreign idea of votes for women. Women's suffrage was seen as far too radical and even foolhardy by many people, including a local bachelor, Percy Clark, who warns the sisters that enfranchisement of women would be home rule with a vengeance, a petticoat government. And these are the kind of details that we're getting from the archives, that we find out exactly what was even said and how they're heckled. But the meeting gathered much media attention, and it gathers media attention because of who the sisters are. They are the daughters of the Gore Booths, this landed estate, the biggest estate in the west of Ireland at the time. And it includes, they get even a mention in Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair at the time. This is particularly prestigious, but until you read what it's actually saying. And as you can see, the meeting was reported in a very condescending manner as generating amusement, and it concluded that the sisters make a pretty picture on the platform, but it is not women of their type who need to assert themselves over man, however it amuses them, and others. And I doubt if the tyrant has much to fear from their little arrows. We will actually see that their arrows were much bigger than this particular reporter thought at the time. Because Eva continues her work in Manchester, and in many ways you start to realise actually that the sisters couldn't organise a suffrage campaign from Sligo because they were constantly going to have false support in some ways because people were fearful maybe of their employers, as the Gore Booth family, or whatever it might be, but they weren't going to be judged as independent women. So Eva continues her work in Manchester, and by the time she settles there fully in 1897, there's actually more Irish people in that city than in their entire home county of Sligo. She moves to this house in Manchester, which President Higgins is hoping actually to get a plaque on at the moment, so there's work towards this, which hopefully... Now this doesn't seem like this, not a really bad house. Many of us would love to live in a house like this in Manchester, but we have to think about where Eva Gore Booth has moved from. And this is where she's moved from. She has moved from a 72-roomed Greek Revival mansion set on 32,000 acres, overlooking this beautiful, I mean, if any of you have been to Lisdale, it's one of the most strikingly beautiful parts of the west of Ireland. The house in Manchester at the turn of the century would have been extremely smog-bound, would have been particularly a nasty environment because of the amount of factories that are there at the time. And certainly what we know is that there's many aristocratic women that get involved in philanthropy at the time, but they go home at night. They go back to their lovely estated property. They do not go back to their house in the middle of Manchester. And actually Glynn reminded me as well that when you look at the census of this time, Eva Gore Booth is living with her female partner, and she's also renting a spare room to another working class couple. So they're trying to get money in whatever way they can. So they're not totally depending on the Gore Booth family. But she devotes herself to organising women workers into trade unions and towards her ultimate goal, which is of obtaining votes for women at general elections. By 1908, Eva was an established and respected trade union organiser. And her main focus that year was on organising the employment of barmaids, or protecting the employment of barmaids. The Liberal government, I'm going to just give you a taster of one of their campaigns, because what we can see as well is that even though it's 1908, women don't have the vote, and a lot of what we focus on is how this is very negative. But we actually can see in some personal papers how women can be politically very successful even without having the vote. So, and this is one particular instance. The Liberal government proposed a licensing bill in 1908, which is essentially to control the sale and consumption of alcohol. And these controls are welcome intervention at a time when alcohol abuse was causing major social issues, especially in the industrial classes. But however, Eva Gore Booth finds a subsection embedded into this licensing bill that would effectively exclude women from working in public houses. And she maintains that this would mean it would throw 100,000 women into unemployment. They weren't offering an alternative employment for these women. They were just saying, we don't want them working in bars, because clearly this was driving men to drink, pretty barmaids, because that was, it was all women's fault again. The controversy regarding the licensing bill reaches an all-time high after a cabinet reshuffle, and a young MP is promoted as President of the Board of Trade, and it was no less than Winston Churchill. Due to contemporary law, Churchill was forced to resign as the MP for Manchester North West and stand for re-election in the same constituency. This was something that was the law at the time, and they generally stood unopposed, so it was kind of taken that he would just get back in and get a seat there. But by then he had become a central figure in the barmaid issue. And here we actually see Winston Churchill arriving in Manchester to start his campaign, if you like. He was confident of a victory, and we can see even by the image of, this is him standing on one of the vehicles for his campaign, and we can see the absolute throngs. The thousands of people come out to listen to Winston Churchill in his campaign. But he didn't take into account the Gore Booth sisters. The sisters launched an intense campaign supporting a Conservative candidate, William Johnson Hicks. And they decide to organise, and you might be able to see partly here, that this is a carriage driven by 4 white horses with Eva and Constance Gore Booth driving around. Countess Markovich is at the whip of the horses, because they're expert horsewomen, remember, because they've grown up on this landed estate. And they stop, and we can, I think I have another one, we can see the attention that they get. I think they probably get a little bit more interest actually than Winston Churchill. These, and this is early on, they're striking looking women, and they've got this carriage and the 4 white horses. And through their efforts, what happens is that they successfully orchestrated the defeat of Winston Churchill at that by-election, because he had promised to ensure not only that the licensing bill would be introduced, but also he wanted to stop all women working after 8 p.m. in the evening. He was also against married women working. There was a lot of issues about, what type of women were actually allowed to work. And Winston Churchill lost his seat by a decent margin and was temporarily forced out of politics. The following day, the Daily Telegraph was jubilant in their headlines. Winston Churchill is out. And he later secured a constituency in the far-off Scottish town of Dundee. When you read the biographies of Churchill, they don't talk about this so much. It's kind of like he lost his seat in Manchester and he ends up in Dundee. Not really a nice place. I'm not saying it's not a nice place, Dundee, it's a lovely place. But to get from Dundee, it's not a handy constituency to be sitting in the House of Commons. It's not something that he wanted. Manchester North West would have suited him geographically in all sorts of different ways much better. But there's no kind of, account of this. The sisters continued lobbying against the licensing bill, so it wasn't just enough to get him out. And within months, the Barmaids League overwhelmingly won their campaign. And what we see is 294 out of 355 MPs rejected the bill. And this was an immense victory. And it really actually shows us a different side, because this is considering that 2 women swayed a political decision, and they actually hadn't got a vote in that by-election. They didn't get a vote, they had no say in the licensing bill whatsoever. By then, the lack of progress, of course, in the Votes for Women campaign forced a group of women to become militant in England. And Ireland soon followed suit. And a militant suffrage organisation was founded by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Margaret Cousins. The question of female suffrage was even more contentious in Ireland than in Britain in the midst of the Home Rule campaign. And we can see certainly popular journalists belittling the Irish suffragettes for aligning themselves with English activists. And in one particular article in D.P. Moran's paper, The Leader, animates this view. And the journalist says how the movement in Ireland smacks rather of imitation of the English, and we do not regard it as a native and spontaneous growth. And that article is in direct response to a public talk that had just been given by Christabel Pankhurst, who we've already heard about this morning. And that's where she addresses an audience in the Rotunda rooms in Dublin. The journalist clearly decided that the suffragette movement was not native to Ireland, yet Pankhurst had in fact been mentored by an Irish woman. It was Eva Gore Booth herself who encouraged Pankhurst to register for a law degree and to campaign for votes for women in earnest. And in Christabel Pankhurst's memoirs, she talks about this. She talks about Eva Gore Booth being her mentor, although Christabel Pankhurst tries to absolutely remove Eva Gore Booth from the entire equation. And Eva Gore Booth, we also have Pankhurst at this stage, is forthright in her assertion that Irish women should now dedicate themselves to the cause of suffrage for women first and home rule second. And this, of course, seems to be what really aggravates the journalist more than anything. But ignoring such directions, Irish feminists attempt to combine the two goals, and they seek to include female suffrage in the terms of the Home Rule Bill sought. The leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, who has already been mentioned as well, John Redmond, refuses to accept this tactic. And his main concern seems to be really that it would outrage the British Prime Minister, Henry Asquith, who was against female suffrage. And in 1912, and it was mentioned earlier on, that two suffragettes attack a carriage with Asquith when he's in Dublin. He's actually going by the GPO in Dublin, but it's John Redmond who's with him in the carriage. And the hatchet that's thrown through the window misses Asquith and hits John Redmond just above the right ear, where he suffers a little cut. So John Redmond is perfectly happy to vote against the suffragettes and vote against including suffrage. He does not really want to have anything to do with them. And we see actually this, appears in the Irish Citizen about John Redmond and John Redmond's activities at the time, because in 1913 we have the introduction of the Women's Franchise Bill, and John Redmond votes against including this and votes against the bill. And this incites Geraldine Manning, a member of the Irish Women's Franchise League, to deface a bust of him on display in Dublin at the Royal Hibernian Academy. Manning left a note alongside the green paint-smeared statue that read, "Why didn't you give us the votes for women, Mr. Redmond? A traitor's face is no adornment to our picture gallery." Redmond's colleague, the MP John Dillon, went further in his condemnation of female suffrage, maintaining that granting women votes at general elections, wait for this, would be the ruin of our Western civilization. It will destroy the home, challenging the headship of God, of man laid down by God. So meanwhile, the labour movement in Ireland are not generally sympathetic to the suffrage cause. Working men are concerned that votes for women would mean, which it did of course, votes for women with property, further oppressing the working classes, or that equality would threaten male wages because women would accept low pay. This is also a fact that was realised by the suffragists in Britain, and when Eva Gore Booth attempted to combine her work in Manchester as secretary of the Women's Trade Union Council with the cause of suffrage, she was forced to relinquish her position. The chair of the council, who was a woman, maintained that the campaign for women's suffrage was a separate and unrelated issue to Labour politics. But Constance was greatly influenced by her sister, and essentially what we do see coming through the personal papers is that it is actually Eva Gore Booth who is the impetus, and people will normally think that it was Eva Gore Booth following on the lines from Constance, but it's not at all. We see Constance's first political activities is being driven by her younger sister. And this is most obvious in her address at the foundation, and it's also this idea as well of including politics and the suffrage movement together. And we see this in Constance's first address at the foundation meeting of the Irish Women Workers' Union, when Markovich implores women to join the union, attesting that, as you're all aware, women have at present no vote, but a union, as has now been formed, will not alone help you to obtain better wages, but will also be a great means of helping you get the votes, and thus make men of you all. So through the labour movement, Constance becomes involved in nationalism and plays a prominent role in the Easter Rising. She's imprisoned for her activities and was one of the final prisoners released, and that was during the amnesty in June 1917. Days later, Eva and Constance decide to celebrate in style. So they go to the House of Commons, where they took to the terrace and ate strawberries and cream. The Manchester Guardian reported the event under the heading "Strange Times in the House." However, Markovich would spend numerous times incarcerated over the coming years. And in April 1918, she was arrested and imprisoned in Holloway as part of the supposed plot with Germany. The Representation of the People Act had just been passed. And in November of that year, we have the Act which will allow women to stand for election. And in that general election of 1918, 17 female candidates stand. Markievicz stood as the Sinn Féin candidate and was the only female to be elected. Now I find this kind of unusual if we think that Christabel Pankhurst, who had been fighting for all those years and was very prominent, did not receive, was not elected, and she actually left England in disgrace for a number of years and moved to France after that. But Markievicz was returned as an MP for St Patrick's Division of Dublin, which makes her the first woman ever to be elected to the British House of Commons. But of course, in line with Sinn Féin policy, she rejected her seat. But the elected members of Sinn Féin formed the first Dáil Éireann in 1919, and when she was released from prison, and of course many of the Sinn Féin candidates were elected while they were in prison, and when she was released, she returned to her first sitting at the Dáil, and later she was nominated as Minister for Labour. So we have the first ever female cabinet minister as well. Irish nationalists celebrated Markievicz's position as proof that a future free state would be based on equality for all Irish citizens. And Markievicz was elected again in 1923 general election, and she again forfeited her seat. In an attempt to re-engage with parliamentary politics, she joined Fianna Fáil upon its establishment in 1926. And, I missed that slide earlier, that's her getting out of prison the first time. And we can see her here as part of the Sinn Féin, or the Fianna Fáil party. She was elected as a Fianna Fáil candidate for Dublin South, and this one in 1927. And we know that this is just weeks before her death, because if you zoom in on it, you can see the cast that she has just broken her arm, and it is actually only weeks later that she dies, and in fact 5 weeks later, at the age of 59. As leader of the upcoming political party, gender equality did not appear to be a central concern for Eamon de Valera. After all, he had refused to accept female insurgents in his outpost that he commanded during the Easter Rising. Years later, he apparently regretted his decision because the men had to cook their own food. But arguably, de Valera included Markievicz as a Fianna Fáil candidate, not out of concern for gender balance or for her feminist politics, but because he was dependent on public support. Markievicz was known, and would still be known, as the People's Countess. And this was an intrinsic element for Fianna Fáil to gain followers. When she died in a public ward of Sir Patrick Dun's Hospital, her legacy quickly began to unfold. Due to ongoing hostilities with the Free State government, Markievicz was denied a state funeral, which is terrible when we think about it now, that this is our first elected cabinet minister, female. Markievicz's body lay in the pillar room of the Rotunda Hospital, and she received a public funeral. But these are the images of her funeral. People travelled from far and wide and overran Dublin, and this is her funeral cortege going across O'Connell Bridge. The next female to succeed Markievicz in a cabinet role in Dáil Éireann, does anybody know?
Yes.
Maura Geoghegan, which was in 1979, 60 years after Markievicz had been a cabinet minister. De Valera had not only wiped out the successes made by Markievicz in a very real way, when he also oversaw the redrafting of the Irish Constitution in 1937, where women were positioned as inferior. Articles were inserted into the document declaring women's ultimate place as being in the domestic sphere, which are still there. Article 41 includes a section declaring that the state recognises by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. The release of the draft version inspired Sheehy Skeffington to write to the Irish Independent, asserting that the Constitution is a fascist model in which women would be relegated to permanent inferiority. And the implications of that 1937 Constitution were far-reaching. coupled with the lack of a strong female replacement for Markievicz in Irish politics. While we have legislation in place now to protect the rights of women in Ireland, unfortunately it doesn't ensure that Irish society operates on a gender equal basis. There is a concern that Irish politics is still male dominated. And in an effort to improve gender balance, it is Markievicz who appears as the icon for change. A full-length painting of the Countess hangs outside on the stairs of Shannon Erin, which was actually painted by her husband, Count Markievicz. The painting was removed during renovations to the building, and during a Shannon debate, Senator Mary Henry noted the importance of ensuring that the painting was returned to its rightful position, because they were taking their time about actually returning it. And her speech highlights the importance not only of Markievicz's work in the shaping of modern Ireland, but as a symbol to inspire future generations. Henry insisted, "It is of great importance to show women were involved in our past. It is essential that women are put before all children, particularly girls, so there was some sort of a role model for them in political life." In March 2014, in an attempt to rectify the gender imbalance of their party, Fianna Fáil launched an inquiry to ascertain how they could increase the numbers of female candidates at future elections. Of course, I would kind of think that's probably because they're losing so much power. What they were trying to do was really see how they could reshape. But significantly, they called the project, it was taken first of all by the Markievicz Commission, and a gender equality document by that name was published later the next year. So it's now time for us really to question the legacy of the Gore-Booth sisters as presented by that famous W.B. Yeats poem, In Memory of Eva Gore-Booth and Con Markievicz. In it, Yeats refers to both Constance and Markievicz, or Constance and Eva, suggesting that they were unfocused and unsuccessful political activists, as he attests that Markievicz drags out lonely years conspiring against the ignorant, while politics turned Gore-Booth withered, old and skeleton gaunt. And while women's participation in Irish politics remains below European average, it's the legacy of Markievicz and Eva Gore-Booth would be a central inspiration for change. Thank you.
Firstly, I would like to say on behalf of the National Trust that both myself and Aileen are thrilled to be here and to be representing a heritage sector organisation in an academic conference. It seems to be, to me, after listening to all of the academic research, that this is quite sort of innovative for someone like me who has cast aside the world of academia, it would seem, and gone into heritage, to be here wondering how we can utilise archives and we can utilise all of this information to better inform the public. And I've been so interested listening to everyone today about what's been coming out, and words like equality, influence, complexity and voice. And to me, that's what this theme of women's suffrage means. It transcends a sort of theme of historic women's suffrage, but also what we as the National Trust were doing last year with Prejudice and Pride in trying to represent sexuality within our properties. And I feel that in this year, our Year of Women, our Year of Women in Power, we can use our archives and use our history and use our artefacts to try and give the characters within our homes a voice, and hopefully allow the public to interact with our archives, which are hitherto hidden, our collections and the property of Mount Stewart. So I don't know whether any of you are familiar with Mount Stewart, but my name is Dr. Neil Watt. I am House and Collections Manager for Mount Stewart and the 15,000 items that sit within it. So it's a huge collection, and it's really, I suppose, incumbent upon me to figure out what do we do with this for the public benefit. And if we crack on to the next slide, I was flicking through a sort of text on museums and heritage, and it made me think about my role as a House and Collections Manager. It says, museums, galleries and heritage sites of all kinds, through the narratives they construct and politically present, can shape the moral and political climate within which human rights are experienced. And I feel that the National Trust, and indeed myself and my colleagues, are taking a brave stand. So there are no taboo subjects within our museums, and that we can make everyone feel universally accepted and universally as though they have a voice. And so it probably is quite brave for us to be moving in this direction. Aileen is going to discuss the papers which are held here at PRONI, which belong to the Londonderry family. So I'm merely here to provide a short introduction. But really, Aileen and I have been on a journey together. I'm only 1.5 years old, although I look much older. I've been 1.5 years in my current position, and as part of my role, I have to curate Mount Stuart House for the public. And during this, we tap into our national public programming themes. And this year, funnily enough, it is women and power. In order to do this, it seemed to me that I had a house which was unrivaled in Ireland. We've just spent £8 million sterling on the restoration of the Mansion House, as well as another 500,000 on Edith Londonderry's bedroom suite and bringing it back to life, as well as £45,000 in cataloguing Edith's huge library of books. But we had another asset at our disposal, and that is our archive. Now I think I'm right in saying we have around 100,000 items in the Londonderry archive, and chatting with the archivists here, it would appear that we have only catalogued not more than 10,000. So there's another 90,000 archives to go. That just opens up amazing possibilities. What will we learn in the future? And Aileen, very kindly and selflessly, as she always does, decided that she would come to PRONI as a volunteer for 1 month and work in the records belonging to Edith Londonderry. Now, she wrote me a little text whenever she came back from work here at PRONI one day, and she said, "Neil, it's all gold. It's just all gold." So everything she was getting, you couldn't have made it up. It just was really, really wonderful. It's changed, I suppose, my experience of Edith, because in thinking about national programming, could we move on? Yes. We were just thinking about how women within our properties had a voice. What did they do? What was their history? And my PhD was in women and marriage of the Irish country house from 1860 to 1920. So I was kind of aware of the socio-political place that they straddled. I was very aware of their practices, wives as partners in marriage. But really, what came out of the archives was pretty amazing. Hidden beneath this woman who was filled with charm and whimsy, and her ark, which was all her friends that she had described as animals, she brought together poets and politicians and royalty. She brought together extremes of people, diverse and eclectic bunches. She also was an incredibly astute woman. She was very intelligent and wrote many, many pamphlets, which you will be talking about very, very shortly. Quoting from statistics and actually having an eye to her poorer sisters as well, having an eye to women who were out working and who were single parents. So really Edith's charm is now being matched by her ability as a wonderful pioneer for women's suffrage. I would just like to point, if we move on, we had a bit of a coup this year, that Edith has made front cover of the National Trust magazine for the year. Here she is in a portrait by de Laszlo in her Women's Legion uniform. And of course the Women's Legion was her big triumph. It was her huge creation, and it's what she is probably best known for now. And if you come to Mount Stuart, you will see the four faces of Edith. You will see her as peeress, you will see her as a horticulturalist, you will see her as Society Belle, but you will also see her as commander of the Women's Legion. Now, around the house we have so many artefacts embossed with the Women's Legion, and whenever I first arrived at Mount Stewart, I didn't actually realise that this is what it all was. I was so overwhelmed by the house and the collection and all of the symbols that it took me a while to spot where all of these little subliminal tokens were placed. But if you look, she had the Women's Legion symbols put on her plant pots. She had her badges. Just a few weeks ago, we noted that she has her Women's Legion stamps on her lampshades. And even if you were invited to dinner at Mount Stewart, she would emboss your butter with the symbol of the Women's Legion, just in case you weren't getting the full political import of women and power. And as I say, we have dedicated a huge amount of funding to Edith Londonderry's inner sanctum, her bedroom. And this is her bed, now fully restored. But if you look at the canopy cloth, which is original, here she had embroidered in silver and gold the symbol of the Women's Legion. And yes, it's unbelievable. Even the lamps on each side of the bed have the symbol of the Women's Legion, the little rose as well. If you walk into the house and look up to the skylights, you can see the roses of the Women's Legion. It's just everywhere. And I suppose it just shows you how her wealth could allow her power to manifest itself. What I would like to say, again very quickly, I only meant to be doing an introduction, is that we are investing in this theme and investing in Mount Stewart. And I wholeheartedly would like to attempt, in a very small way, to try and reinvent how people see buildings like the National Trust and Mount Stewart and Spring Hill and the Argoury, etc., etc. We are places where people can come and where we can provide questions. We can ask questions, but like Glynn did, we can ask, but we don't have all the answers, but we can ask questions and stimulate debate. And we are meant to be, and as our slogan says, forever for everyone. So it's my earnest wish that that's what we try and do. And I hope this year we do this through archival knowledge, through accentuating our collection, and also in November by reaching our crescendo in inviting the National Portrait Gallery of London to set up an exhibition in our central hall dedicated to women's suffrage. And they'll be bringing over 47 pieces of work from London and setting it up in Mount Stewart from November until February. And we'll be open throughout the winter for you to come and see that as well. Also, Conversations this year, our sort of socio-political event, which happens on an annual basis, will be devoted to women and power as well. So I hope that the house and the offer, and you guys in coming to the house, that you will be able to explore challenging themes and not just a pretty house with pretty gardens. But anyway, I'll pass over to Aileen and she can take you through the archive.
Hello everyone. Yes, as Neil says, I come from Mount Stewart. My role is Collections Management System Officer, and that sounds very boring, but actually what it means is that I spend most of my day rooting around in the drawers, cupboards at Mount Stewart and cataloguing our 15,000-ish objects. And so I am intimately familiar with the objects and the collection of Mount Stewart, and I felt as though I was intimately familiar with this family. I felt like I knew them. I felt like I'm in their space every day. But in coming to PRONI for a month, I realised that I just had an idea of someone, and in coming here, I've heard these people's voices, and I know I feel like I've got a personal connection with Edith Lily Londonderry and her family. I didn't really expect to get to work on the Londonderry papers. When I came here, I was happy just to do anything and to be involved in the archive here at PRONI, but the team here were kind enough to let me catalogue some of Lily Londonderry's papers, particularly most relevantly to our year of work, her writing on suffrage. I sort of thought I would come and have to root around, but Edith made it very easy for me. She wrote directly, consistently, articulately on the subject of women's suffrage. And I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the documents that I found and just what I found inspiring and interesting about them. So the first piece I'd like to show you is a handwritten address by Lady Londonderry to the Conservative Unionist Women's Franchise Association, bit of mouthful, in 1909. And I just thought this was so interesting, not only to see Edith's handwriting and to see her thoughts and her corrections, but also to realise that this is something that she said. This is an address that she gave. These were the words that she spoke, and you can see her underlining her paragraphs and to make her points. And in this document, she sets out herself as a constitutional suffragist, aligns herself against the suffragettes. She refers to their organisation as the main body, forming a strong constitutional force, as opposed to wings composed of irregular troops and used to discipline. And so you sort of get a sense of Edith trying to go about things in a measured and sort of a political, constitutional way. And I think that speaks to Edith's connections. As Neil said, this year we've catalogued the library at Mount Stewart, and that has been a wonderful experience, pulling out first editions of books with handwritten inscriptions from authors and writers and politicians, all interested in Edith's voice and conversing with Edith. And several of the poems in this collection sort of speak to Edith's engagement and familiarity with the movers and shakers of the day. The first in the collection is a poem entitled "The Dream of the Pasha, who joined the Anti-Suffragette League," in which she is addressing a pasha without a harem. So I don't know who that is, but it's obviously somebody very specific who she was targeting, and it's quite a scary tale in which he gets his comeuppance until he can get the pretty ladies of the suffragette movement on his side, and eventually they rise up and he has a nightmare. He wakes up screaming. And this second piece, the debates in the House of Commons on women's suffrage, described by a friendly critic. We've got Edith making little witty retorts and making direct reference to anti-suffrage speakers and pro-suffrage politicians. We've got Effie Smith there, who Edith wrote a retort in the Times against a piece that anti-suffrage piece that he had written, and I particularly like stanza 19, where she warns against ministers making promises that are not binding, because a pledge is not a pledge, for women are not yet electors, 'tis the thin end of the wedge. Now, this is Neil's favourite quote, and it's one that I've heard him repeat often. Every time he tells it, it's slightly different. So I thought I would put the direct quote at the top there. This is a brief note. This is the entirety of the note that you're seeing there. It's Edith just sort of dashing off some comments on suffrage, and through all of these papers, what's so interesting is that she is so articulate and in. Ooh, let's turn off the light. Actually, it's better. Things will just be dashed off in paper, but there'll be a complete thought, like this. For example, why should women be queens, mayors, county councillors, and not considered fit to have a vote? And when you consider that Edith was rubbing shoulders with queens and mayors and was a county councillor herself, she could comment firsthand. And Neil's favourite part, that they could be a doctor and as such able to exercise the legal power to sign a certificate of insanity which would deprive a man of his vote, but not able to vote herself. So it goes on to mention the women being encouraged to campaign and be politically involved, but not to be given a vote, to influence other men to vote, but not have that direct power. And that is a point that Edith comes back to repeatedly, is this idea of indirect and direct influence. So this is a pamphlet that she produced entitled Women's Indirect Influence, and I think it's interesting that in this she is directly influencing her audience, and she is setting out her views and publishing them and feeling that her voice is valid. And in it she is scathing of indirect influence. In some instances she says that it is more dangerous than a direct one, more easily manoeuvred and more insidious. And she is sort of in some ways making a moral argument. She's asking that she's saying that if women are allowed to act honourably and openly, that they would prove themselves, that they would prove that they can be loyal to each other, and that they could be held to a higher standard. Another pamphlet that she produces is called The Origin of the Vote and Other Historical Facts, which is a rebuttal to Countess Ancaster, her pamphlet, The Vote, Not a Right but a Trust. And in that she's making direct rebuttals to remarks in that first pamphlet. And it's an incredibly well-researched, factual document. In fact, throughout these papers, she has a lot of facts about working women. She can quote figures, the number of women who are single-parent households, and how post women are paid significantly less than their counterparts. So a debate that we are still having today, the gender wage gap. But just very interesting to see her having not only feeling that her position affords her the authority to speak, but having an informed opinion. And in her second pamphlet, she makes reference to a British Free Woman, a book by C.C. Stokes, where all of her facts have come from. Women's Legion at Mount Stewart is sort of a buzzword. We talk about the Women's Legion, we discuss that beautiful Delassley portrait, and we expect everybody to know what we're talking about. And I felt like I had an idea, but in coming here, I got the opportunity to catalogue some of Edith's Women's Legion papers, and really amazing opportunity to see her develop an organisation that let women do their duties as women and not as makeshift men, to be part of the war effort, to provide their services, and to prove themselves. In her memoir Retrospect, Edith recounts a bet that she had with a newspaper editor. He bet that by the end of the war there will be no suffragettes. War will teach women the impossibility of their demand and the absurdity of their claims. Edith immediately took that bet because she felt that the war would be an opportunity for women to prove themselves, and that there would be no suffragettes by the end of the war because they would have won their cause. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of the Women's Legion papers, and just point out some of the interesting approaches that Edith had. Firstly, that it was an organisation that is open to all sorts and classes of women. And this is the enrolment form. You can see it wouldn't take much to sign yourself up to become part of the Women's Legion. As well as this, we see Edith formulating constitutions and notes from a meeting where they decide on the name. The Women's Legion developed out of the Women's Volunteer Reserve, and so you see Edith proposing that we should change this name because the Women's Volunteer Reserve is a boring name that nobody can remember, and the Women's Legion is a good Roman name that would be memorable and would attract attention to their cause. So as well as that, you also see her engaging in disciplinary matters and conversing with the War Office. So we start to get a sense of Edith involved in every aspect of this organisation, right from top level decision making, right down to letters to individual cooks who are having personal problems with with their managers, and I think I found it really fascinating just to see Edith's sometimes confusion or a misinterpretation of events, and how those are resolved in the papers. And I thought this was particularly interesting when we talked about Constance Markovich marketing herself. I think Edith is a wonderful example of someone branding themselves. The Women's Legion. You saw how many symbols we have at Mount Stuart. And so for me it was fascinating to see this document where Edith is designing the President's badge. She's got multiple suggestions there, some of which are maybe a little bit more controversial than others. But you know, she's building this from the ground up, and she understands that having letter-headed paper and having a badge and having a uniform all make something more legitimate and give credence to those efforts. As well as this, there are some recommendations for fabric, so that members of the Women's Legion would buy and have their uniforms made up, so you get a sense of them having the instructions to make themselves part of this movement. There's also some local interest. There were some letters between Edith and the Belfast City Hall and the Mayor, where they're discussing the possible development of a Women's Legion section in Belfast. And I thought it was interesting that he says that while the meeting might be well attended, the actual carrying out of the proposed scheme might not be successful. And I think that's interesting in terms of what we've heard today about there being other concerns in Ulster at the time that may have prevented people from getting involved in a war effort. So these are a few examples of some of the boxes that I was trawling through during my time here, and what I was struck by every day was just the sheer volume of material. This is D3099/14, so this is the files relating to non-political organisations, clubs and charities. There were 13 boxes of these documents, and so that's Charles the 7th Marquess and Lady Londonderry's papers, but just the sheer volume of material that could potentially help us tell this story. The breadth and depth of Edith's involvement in the organisations that she was involved in. Some of the others that I didn't get a chance to look at but peeked in were the Red Cross, the Ulster Comfort Fund and the War Service Legion. And you can see this really striking poster there for the a needlework display, and we have a few photos of that. But yes, so much more work still to do, and for me it felt as though this was just a tiny glimpse of what could potentially be of use to us at Mount Stuart. And what we've really found is that we have the space, we have the object, we have the sort of platform to tell these stories. So we need to be connecting with this material because it's there. Edith's voice is there. She's shouting strongly. She's got something to say, and her points are nuanced and as valid today as they were when she wrote them in the early 1900s. And so really I would just like to say thank you to PRONI for letting me come and experience these papers, and I would just encourage you, if you're interested at all, if this has sparked your imagination in any way, come and read Edith's writing, because it's incredibly powerful and moving. So thank you very much.